Before there were borders, there were paths, worn by countless feet across forests, plains, and deserts. This was not an empty land. It was home to millions, speaking hundreds of languages, from the Haudenosaunee in the Northeast to the Powhatan in the Chesapeake, the Wampanoag on New England shores, the Mississippian descendants along great rivers, and the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest. In the early 1600s, winds carried wooden ships toward these coasts, following earlier Spanish, French, and English voyages. Spain had already planted a lasting outpost at St. Augustine in 1565. In 1607, the English raised palisades at Jamestown, seeking profit and survival. A year later, France fortified a river bluff at Quebec under Samuel de Champlain. In 1620, English families anchored off a cold New England strand and founded Plymouth. Each arrival carried maps and assumptions. That land could be claimed by charter and marked by flags. Yet the reality on the ground was negotiation, alliance, and conflict. Corn, fish, and trade sustained fragile beginnings. Misunderstandings and disease cut deep on both sides, but overwhelmingly among the indigenous communities. Rivers became corridors of exchange, beaver for iron, knowledge for survival, while European rivalries leapt the ocean. Spain's mission stretched north from Florida. The Dutch opened New Netherland along the Hudson. England's scattered colonies took root along the Atlantic tidewater. From these precarious footholds, a larger story would grow, of ideas about liberty and power, and of contradictions between freedom proclaimed and freedom denied. The American story does not begin with a blank slate. It begins with encounters between peoples, empires, ecologies, and beliefs. As we travel from the 1600s to the year 2000, we will move slowly and carefully, focusing on what the documents, dates, and archaeology can support, and leaving myths at the shore. If you value calm, fact-based history, pause to subscribe to Sleeping History, like this episode, and share it with someone who loves a quiet story well told. Our journey starts here. The century and a half between 1600 and 1750 laid the scaffolding for what would become the United States, politically, economically, and culturally. But it did not begin on a blank continent. Indigenous nations, Haudenosaunee in the Northeast, Powhatan in the Chesapeake, Wampanoag in New England, Powhatan-affiliated groups in Tidewater, the Catawba and Cherokee in the Southeast, the Powhatan's Algonquian neighbors and Pueblo peoples in the Southwest, had long-established homelands, trade networks, diplomacy, and conflicts of their own. European colonization unfolded within, against, and often through those indigenous systems. In 1607, the English planted Jamestown beside the tidal James River, hoping for quick profits. The colony survived its early crises through a fragile mesh of trade with Powhatan peoples, the adaptation of tobacco as an export crop, and an expanding labor force that initially included indentured Europeans and, increasingly across the 1600s, enslaved Africans. By 1619, a representative assembly met in Virginia, and the first recorded Africans arrived in English North America, markers of a political experiment and a forced labor system that would grow together, uneasily and enduringly. To the north, the Pilgrims established Plymouth in 1620, followed by the larger Puritan migration to Massachusetts Bay in the 1630s. Their goal was not profit alone, but the creation of reformed Christian communities they believed the English church had failed to realize. Towns clustered around meeting houses. Literacy, to read scripture, was prized, and local autonomy within a godly commonwealth set a template that shaped New England's civic life. New England's settlement was neither smooth nor peaceful. The Pequot War of 1636–1637, fought among English colonists, their native allies, and the Pequot, ended with the near destruction of the Pequot as a distinct political force. 4 decades later, King Philip's War, 1675–1676, led by the Wampanoag leader Metacom, called Philip by the English, and joined by multiple native groups, devastated towns across New England and inflicted catastrophic losses on indigenous populations. These wars hardened colonial attitudes, accelerated English expansion, and redrew the human geography of southern New England. While English settlements spread, other empires defined the early map. The Dutch established New Netherland in the 1620s, a commercial colony anchored at New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. Focused on the fur trade and tolerant of religious diversity, the Dutch planted a cosmopolitan outpost that the English seized in 1664, renaming it New York. New Jersey emerged from the same conquest. Dutch patterns of property holding and pluralism persisted beneath English rule, shaping the region's culture. South of the Chesapeake, the Carolinas took form as proprietary ventures in the late 1600s. Rice cultivation, adapted with African agricultural knowledge and labor, transformed South Carolina's lowcountry into a wealthy, plantation-dominated society by the early 1700s. Indigo later joined rice as a cash crop. These profits depended upon a rapidly expanding enslaved African population, and the risks of coastal farming, disease, and resistance defined daily life. Maryland began in 1632 as a proprietary colony under the Calvert family, with the 1649 Act of Toleration granting limited religious freedom to Trinitarian Christians. Pennsylvania, founded in 1681 by William Penn as a haven for Quakers, offered generous land terms, promoted religious toleration beyond many other colonies, and cultivated fair-dealing rhetoric with native peoples. Philadelphia rapidly became a hub of Atlantic commerce, printing, and thought. Meanwhile, Georgia, chartered in 1732 under James Oglethorpe, served as a buffer against Spanish Florida and initially banned slavery. That ban was lifted in the 1750s, and the colony's economy and society soon resembled its lowcountry neighbor. European colonies did not expand in isolation. They grew within rivalries that spanned oceans. Spain's claims ran from Florida across the Gulf Coast into the southwest, anchored by missions and presidios. In 1680, the Pueblo Revolt, led by a Tewa religious leader often called Pepe, expelled Spanish rule from much of New Mexico for over a decade. A reminder that indigenous resistance could reorder imperial plans. France, meanwhile, built New France along the St. Lawrence River and extended a vast network down the Mississippi, claiming Louisiana in 1682. French traders and officials pursued alliances with numerous native nations, building a fur trade empire maintained as much by diplomacy as by forts. Imperial wars repeatedly crossed into North America. King William's War, 1689–1697, Queen Anne's War, 1702–1713, and King George's War, 1744–1748, colonial theaters of European conflicts, brought raids, shifting alliances, and territorial adjustments. The 1713 Treaty of Utrecht transferred Acadia, present-day Nova Scotia, to Britain, tightening the imperial vice on New France and foreshadowing later Anglo-French showdowns. Colonial militias, native allies, and European regulars all played roles. Local communities paid in blood, taxes, and disrupted trade. English colonial governance evolved through friction. The Crown sought tighter control via the Dominion of New England, 1686–1689, consolidating several northern colonies under Governor Edmund Andros. The Glorious Revolution in England in 1688 toppled King James II, and colonists in Boston promptly deposed Andros in 1689. Although the Dominion ended, the episode revealed a recurring pattern: imperial consolidation, colonial resistance, and negotiated recalibration. A new charter for Massachusetts in 1691 merged Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay and broadened the franchise beyond church membership. Authority was shared, but uneasily, between royal governors and local assemblies. Economic life in the colonies turned on land, labor, and Atlantic markets. In Virginia and Maryland, tobacco dominated by the mid-1600s, and indentured servitude gave way over time to enslaved labor codified in law. In the Carolinas and later Georgia, rice and indigo required large, coordinated labor forces and specialized knowledge. Enslaved Africans brought expertise in wet rice cultivation from West and West Central Africa. In New England, small farms, fisheries, and timber supported a diverse economy. Shipbuilding flourished in places like Boston and Portsmouth. Middle colonies blended grain exports, artisan trades, and port commerce, with Philadelphia and New York tying hinterlands to Atlantic credit. Mercantilism, Europe's prevailing economic doctrine, shaped colonial trade. The Navigation Acts, passed in stages beginning in 1651 and refined through 1660 and 1663, aimed to channel colonial commerce through English ships and ports. These laws nurtured a protected maritime economy for English merchants and shipbuilders while constraining colonial options. In practice, enforcement waxed and waned, smuggling was common, and salutary neglect often prevailed so long as commerce enriched the empire. Colonial society grew dramatically. Estimates suggest the English mainland colonies held roughly 250,000 people by 1700 and over 1.5 million by mid-century, including a rapidly increasing enslaved population. High birth rates among Europeans, continued immigration from the British Isles, Germany, and elsewhere, and forced migration from Africa made the colonies young, expanding, and restless. Townships spread inland. Indigenous nations navigated new pressures through diplomacy, trade, relocation, and resistance. The legal architecture of race and slavery hardened in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Virginia's 1705 Slave Code consolidated earlier statutes, tethering African descent to chattel slavery and restricting movement, assembly, and legal recourse. Similar laws spread across colonies. The slave trade, organized by European and colonial merchants, tore people from West and West Central Africa, brutalized them on the Middle Passage, and sold them into hereditary bondage. Enslaved people forged families, faiths, and resistance in the harshest conditions, shaping colonial societies from the ground up. Resistance took many forms. In South Carolina, the Stono Rebellion of 1739 saw enslaved Africans rise, seize arms, and march toward Spanish Florida, where freedom had been promised to fugitives who embraced Catholicism. The rebellion was suppressed with violence, and the colony tightened its black codes. Yet the event stands as a stark testament to the constant tension beneath plantation wealth and to the agency of people who refused their bondage. Not all black freedom in the era was imagined. Near St. Augustine, Spain supported a free black community at Fort Mose, formally established in 1738. Populated by formerly enslaved people from English colonies, who escaped south and pledged loyalty to the Spanish crown. The settlement embodied an imperial chessboard where freedom and allegiance intertwined. Conflict with native nations remained a structural reality of colonial life. In the southeast, the Yamasee War, 1715-1717, pitted a coalition of indigenous groups against South Carolina over debt, trade abuses, and land encroachments, nearly toppling the colony before it ended. In the interior, the Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, managed a complex diplomatic balance, known in part through the Covenant Chain, working with English officials and other native nations to shape trade and security. Across regions, native diplomacy, warfare, and movement decisively influenced colonial fate. Religion and ideas knit communities and sparked contention. New England's clergy organized town-centered congregational life. But dissenters, like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, challenged orthodoxy in the 1630s and helped point the way toward Rhode Island's broader toleration. Maryland's experiment in toleration waxed and waned with politics. Pennsylvania welcomed Quakers, Mennonites, Lutherans, and Reformed Protestants, creating a variegated religious landscape. In 1692, Massachusetts convulsed in the Salem witch trials, producing executions and imprisonments before skepticism and procedural doubts halted the prosecutions. The episode revealed social strains, legal pitfalls, and the perils of spectral evidence. From the 1730s into the 1740s, the First Great Awakening, an intercolonial wave of Protestant revivals, stirred new religious energies. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards in New England and George Whitefield, itinerant across colonies, emphasized personal conversion and emotional piety. The revivals crossed social lines, challenged some ecclesiastical authorities, and encouraged lay participation. They also generated controversy, with New Light supporters and Old Light skeptics debating proper doctrine and conduct. The ferment trained colonists to dispute authority while couching change in the language of spiritual renewal. The Enlightenment worked alongside revivalism. Colonists read Locke on government and natural rights, Newton on natural philosophy, and Montesquieu on balance of powers. Franklin's experiments with electricity, his printing business, and his civic projects in Philadelphia exemplified an applied enlightenment. Curiosity turned to institutions, libraries, fire companies, learned societies, and to a public sphere where pamphlets and newspapers multiplied. Education reflected these currents. Harvard College opened in 1636 to prepare ministers. The College of William and Mary followed in 1693, Yale in 1701, the College of New Jersey, later Princeton, in 1746, and the College of Philadelphia, later the University of Pennsylvania, took form in the 1740s. These institutions seated elites in church and state and helped circulate both Orthodox theology and Enlightenment thought. Print culture matured with colonial society. In 1735, the trial of printer John Peter Zenger in New York became a landmark for press freedom in the Anglo-American world. Though the legal doctrine remained unsettled, the jury's acquittal signaled a colonial willingness to shield printers who criticized officials, an early rehearsal for later debates over rights and power. Politics in the colonies hinged on assemblies and local offices. Property-holding white men voted for representatives who guarded the power of the purse against royal governors and proprietors. Patronage networks mattered, so did local taxation and land policy. While social hierarchies were real and often rigid, the sheer abundance of land on the frontier secured, it must be said, through dispossession, let some colonists imagine a broader access to independence than in crowded European societies. Social life varied regionally. New England's towns, with compact settlement and mixed agriculture, differed from the dispersed plantations of the Chesapeake and the communal rice plantations of the Lowcountry. The middle colonies mixed villages and market towns, with large estates along the Hudson contrasting with small farms in Pennsylvania. Diversity, religious, linguistic, and legal, was most pronounced in the Middle Colonies and New York, where Dutch legacies and new migrations mingled. Gender shaped opportunity and constraint. Colonial law typically subsumed a married woman's legal identity under her husband's in the doctrine of coverture, limiting property control and contracts. Yet women labored centrally in households, markets, and churches. Widows sometimes managed property, and in urban centers, women participated in trades and shopkeeping. In enslaved communities, women's work sustained families and cultures despite the crushing conditions of bondage. Currency and credit tied colonists to Atlantic markets. Coins were scarce. Barter, book credit, and bills of exchange circulated. Massachusetts issued paper money in 1690 to finance a military expedition, and other colonies followed with varying success. Debates over hard versus soft money and over metropolitan attempts to curb colonial emissions foreshadowed later fiscal conflicts with Britain. From Boston to Charleston, harbors hummed with the triangular flows of goods and people. New England rum went to African coasts. Enslaved people were carried across the Atlantic. Sugar and molasses returned from the Caribbean. Grain, timber, and salted fish fed Caribbean plantations. Manufactured goods, textiles, and ironware arrived from Britain, while raw materials and profits flowed back. Within this web, colonial merchants negotiated risk, credit, and insurance with a sophistication born of necessity. Violence and coercion remained embedded in the system. Beyond formal wars and slave codes, local conflicts erupted. Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, an alliance of frontier settlers against Virginia's colonial government, exposed tensions over land, native policy, and elite control. Although the rebellion was crushed, colonial elites increasingly turned from indentured labor to enslaved labor, seeing it as more controllable and permanent, a grim recalibration that shaped the 1700s. By mid-century, the English mainland colonies had taken recognizable form. New England was a lattice of towns, schools, and meeting houses, tied to fisheries and Atlantic trade. The Middle Colonies balanced ports and farms, brimming with migrants and religious pluralism. The Chesapeake exported tobacco through planter networks. The Lower South exported rice and indigo through plantation regimes, where enslaved Africans often outnumbered Europeans. Across all three regions, indigenous nations remained key actors, shaping frontiers and trade through alliance and resistance. The political culture that would later yield revolution was not yet fully born, but its components were present. Colonists grew accustomed to self-government in assemblies, to arguing in print, to balancing local interests against imperial ones, and to invoking law and rights in everyday disputes. Imperial authority remained real in governors, customs officers, and military forces, but colonists had learned to negotiate its limits. Religious life had broadened from Puritan orthodoxy to a mosaic textured by Anglicans, Baptists, Presbyterians, Quakers, Lutherans, Reformed congregations, Jews in a few port cities, and Catholics in pockets like Maryland. Revival stirred energy. Enlightenment inquiry questioned assumptions. Both taught colonists to evaluate authority by conscience and reason. Demographically, the colonies were young, expanding, and mobile. Land hunger drove settlement up river valleys and into Piedmonts, pushing frontiers into contested spaces. Scots-Irish and German migrants joined English settlers, while the forced migration of Africans continued to grow the enslaved population. Cities Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston remained small by European standards but pulsed with mercantile ambition. The moral contradictions were stark. Colonists celebrated English liberties, defended local representation, and hailed the right to property. Yet the wealth of many rested on dispossession of indigenous lands, and the bondage of Africans and their descendants. Some protested slavery early, many participated in it, others lived beside it while focusing on their own pursuits. This contradiction would not vanish with time, it would deepen as prosperity grew. The imperial horizon darkened in the 1740s. King George's War scarred the northern frontier and flushed New England into Atlantic ventures like the capture of Louisburg in 1745, later traded away in diplomacy to colonial frustration. On the interior lines, British and French empires eyed the Ohio country, courting native allies and preparing for a larger conflict that would soon engulf the continent. As 1750 approached, the colonies had assembled the elements of a distinct society: habits of self-rule, a thriving press, churches in ferment, a layered economy tied to the Atlantic, and a population mixing free and unfree, native-born and immigrant, indigenous and European and African. Their loyalties still ran to the crown and to the rights of English subjects. Their grievances were episodic, their ambitions local. But the foundations, institutions, contradictions, aspirations were in place. The next chapter will thrust these foundations into crisis. Empires will collide in the 7 Years' War. Victory will bring new taxes and new expectations. And colonists will discover that the language they honed to defend their rights in the 1600s and early 1700s carries revolutionary implications in the 1760s and 1770s. For now, in 1750, the colonies stand poised, rooted in habit and hierarchy, energizing with growth and diversity, and walking unknowingly toward a political storm of their own making. Between 1750 and 1775, a web of imperial conflicts, fiscal policies, and colonial debates transformed British North America from loyal provinces into a restless political community ready for open resistance. The process was gradual rather than sudden, shaped by war debts, frontier violence, commercial regulation, and ideas about rights that colonists believed they inherited as English subjects. The spark was an imperial rivalry. In the early 1750s, Britain and France vied for influence in the interior, especially the Ohio country, where rivers linked the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. French officials extended a chain of forts from the St. Lawrence through the Great Lakes toward the Ohio, strengthening alliances with native nations central to the fur trade. British traders and land speculators, backed by colonial governors and companies, pressed west as well. For many indigenous communities, the contest posed stark choices with limited guarantees. In 1754, colonial delegates gathered at Albany to fortify relations with the Haudenosaunee-Iroquois Confederacy and to consider joint defense. Benjamin Franklin sketched his join, or die serpent, and proposed an intercolonial union plan with a common council for frontier security. The plan failed, colonies guarded their autonomy, but the meeting revealed a dawning recognition that scattered provinces faced shared problems. That same year, fighting in the backcountry escalated. A young Virginia officer, George Washington, led a small expedition that clashed with French forces near present-day southwestern Pennsylvania. The confrontation and Washington's subsequent retreat from Fort Necessity in 1754 were local events, yet they foreshadowed a broader struggle: the French and Indian War in North America, part of the global 7 Years' War that would formally begin in 1756. Early British campaigns struggled. In 1755, General Edward Braddock's column, moving against Fort Duquesne, was ambushed and shattered along the Monongahela. Frontier communities suffered raids. Indigenous alliances were decisive in both harassing settlements and defending French positions. Over time, British strategy shifted under William Pitt, who poured resources into North America, mobilized colonial support, and targeted key French strongholds. the tide turned. In 1758, British forces captured Louisbourg, opening the St. Lawrence. That same year, French evacuated and the British seized Fort Duquesne, renamed Pittsburgh. In 1759, after a daring night ascent, British troops under James Wolfe defeated French forces under Louis-Joseph de Montcalm on the plains of Abraham outside Quebec. Both commanders fell in battle. Montreal surrendered in 1760. With the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France ceded Canada to Britain and transferred Louisiana west of the Mississippi to Spain, reshaping the imperial map. Victory carried a price. War expenditures and the costs of occupying new territories produced a heavy British debt. At the same time, the collapse of the French presence altered the frontier's balance. British authorities sought to stabilize relations and reduce military expenses by restricting settler expansion. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 drew a line along the crest of the Appalachians, reserving lands westward for indigenous nations and regulating trade and settlement. Many colonists, especially land speculators and frontier settlers, bristled at the barrier. They saw service and sacrifice in the war as entitling them to Western opportunity. Conflict on the frontier made the stakes clear. In 1763, Pontiac and allied leaders from multiple native nations coordinated assaults on British forts and settlements in the Great Lakes and Ohio regions. The violence, often called Pontiac's War, sprang from grievances over British policies that curtailed gifts and commerce and ignored diplomatic protocols maintained by the French. The British eventually negotiated and fought their way to a tenuous peace by 1766. But the war underlined that imperial victory over France did not grant uncontested dominion in the interior. Parliament, facing sustained debts, turned to customs enforcement and new duties. The Sugar Act of 1764, a revision of earlier molasses duties, aimed to raise revenue and tighten enforcement against smuggling, particularly in the Atlantic trade. The Currency Act of 1764 restricted colonial paper money, complicating local credit systems. Many merchants and consumers felt the pinch, but the deeper controversy concerned principle. Could Parliament tax the colonies for revenue when they had no representatives there? The Stamp Act of 1765 sharpened the debate. It required stamped paper, purchased from Crown agents, for legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards. Because it touched lawyers, printers, merchants, and ordinary consumers alike, opposition spread rapidly. Colonial resolves, famously in Virginia, where Patrick Henry's rhetoric in the House of Burgesses challenged Parliament's authority, echoed across assemblies. Crowds in Boston and other towns targeted stamp distributors with intimidation and property destruction. Many resigned before the law took effect. Colonial leaders tried coordinated petitioning. Delegates from 9 colonies met in New York at the Stamp Act Congress in late 1765, affirming loyalty to the Crown, while insisting that taxation for revenue without colonial consent violated rights of Englishmen. Non-importation agreements, voluntary boycotts of British goods, put economic pressure on merchants and manufacturers across the Atlantic. Women's participation proved crucial. Spinning bees and homespun cloth symbolized civic virtue and practical resistance, and household choices reinforced public protest. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but paired repeal with the Declaratory Act, asserting its power to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The immediate crisis cooled. Yet the constitutional question, where sovereignty lay in a composite empire, remained unresolved. Many colonists celebrated the repeal as a restoration of balance, not a revolution. Still, a pattern was emerging: imperial assertion, colonial mobilization, partial retreat and lingering distrust. The next confrontation came with the Townshend Acts of 1767, which imposed duties on imports such as glass, paper, paint, and tea. Revenue would pay royal officials' salaries in the colonies, potentially lessening Assembly's leverage. Again, colonists organized non-importation. Newspapers and pamphlets argued the distinction between external trade regulation and internal taxation had blurred. Boston, a hotbed of activism and a vital port, became a focus of enforcement and protest. Tensions escalated as troops arrived to maintain order. Street confrontations, legal challenges, and mutual suspicion culminated on March 5, 1770, when soldiers fired into a crowd near the Customs House in Boston, killing 5 civilians. The Boston Massacre, as engravings and accounts labeled it, instantly became a symbol. John Adams and other lawyers defended the soldiers in court, and most were acquitted. The legal process underscored a commitment to law even amid anger. Parliament, meanwhile, repealed most Townshend duties that same year, except the tea duty, a symbolic and financial thread left hanging. The early 1770s were not quiet, only uneven. In 1772, the burning of the customs schooner Gaspee off Rhode Island, after it ran aground while chasing a suspected smuggler, exposed the depth of local resentment toward customs enforcement. Committees of correspondence formed across Massachusetts and then other colonies, establishing networks to share news and coordinate responses. These committees knit the provinces into a more coherent political community. On the edge of authority, other conflicts signaled social strain. The North Carolina regulator movement, built from backcountry grievances over fees, taxes, and representation, erupted into violence and ended at the Battle of Alamance in 1771, where colonial militia defeated the regulators. In Pennsylvania, the Paxton Boys' 1763-1764 attacks on peaceful indigenous communities and a march on Philadelphia revealed the volatility of frontier politics. Such episodes warned that imperial disputes overlapped with internal divisions about power and justice. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, designed to aid the struggling East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price. With the Townshend, tea duty still applied. The act lowered tea's cost, but colonists saw a dangerous precedent, a monopoly backed by Parliament's taxation power. In Boston, after tense standoffs over unloading the tea and the governor's refusal to clear the ships to depart, local activists boarded vessels on the night of December 16, 1773, and dumped cargo into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party was dramatic political theater with a clear message: no revenue taxes without consent, no monopolies imposed from afar. The British response was swift. In 1774, Parliament enacted the Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port until restitution, altering Massachusetts's charter to limit town meetings and expand the governor's power, allowing royal officials accused of capital offenses to be tried elsewhere, and strengthening quartering provisions. Simultaneously, the Quebec Act reorganized Canada's governance, extending its boundaries into the Ohio country and recognizing Catholic institutions. To colonists, the combination looked like a deliberate encirclement of their liberties and ambitions. Resistance spread from Boston outward. Across colonies, town meetings and assemblies denounced the measures. Committees called for renewed non-importation and non-consumption. Support for Boston arrived in the form of provisions from other colonies, a sign that local grievances now resonated continent-wide. The idea of a General Congress gained traction as a way to coordinate strategies and present a united front. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They affirmed loyalty to the Crown but endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, backing Massachusetts's resistance, and adopted the Continental Association, a framework for non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation of British goods, with local committees to enforce compliance. The Congress petitioned the King and outlined principles. Colonists owed obedience to Parliament's regulation of external trade for the Empire's benefit, but not to taxation or internal legislation without their consent. The winter of 1774-1775 was a season of preparation and uncertainty. Massachusetts, under General Thomas Gage's military governorship, stood at the center of tension. Provincial congresses collected arms, drilled militia, and formed Minutemen units. Pamphlets multiplied. Sermons framed political duty in moral terms. Printers like those in Philadelphia and Boston fed a public hungry for news and argument. Most colonists still hoped for reconciliation on terms that restored what they saw as traditional rights. Events outran those hopes in the spring. On the night of April 18, 1775, British regulars marched from Boston toward Concord to seize military stores, while riders, among them Paul Revere and William Dawes, carried alarms to the countryside. At dawn on April 19, militia faced redcoats on Lexington Green. A shot, its origin disputed, was fired and the skirmish left colonists dead. The British pushed on to Concord, where fighting at the North Bridge forced them to withdraw. The return march to Boston turned into a running battle as militia fired from behind walls and trees. By nightfall, siege lines formed around the city. In the weeks that followed, New Englanders and militia from other colonies converged on the siege. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold captured Fort Ticonderoga on May 10, 1775, securing artillery that would later prove decisive. On June 17, the Battle of Bunker Hill, fought largely on Breed's Hill, saw British forces take the heights at heavy cost, demonstrating that colonial militia could stand against professional troops when well-positioned and supplied. Political institutions kept pace with events. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, assuming responsibilities that looked increasingly like national governance, raising the Continental Army, appointing George Washington as commander-in-chief, managing finances, and seeking foreign aid. At the same time, moderates pressed for reconciliation. The Olive Branch Petition, approved in July 1775, professed loyalty and asked the king to intervene. George III declined, declaring the colonies in rebellion. The room for compromise narrowed to a sliver. Behind the marching columns and parliamentary acts lay a set of ideas that colonists had refined over decades. They spoke the language of the common law and the rights of Englishmen. They drew on political writers who praised balanced government and warned against corruption. They argued that legitimate power rested on consent. Colonial assemblies, print culture, and church life had trained generations to debate authority within a shared moral vocabulary. When imperial policies seemed to bypass local consent and threaten established liberties, those habits translated into organized resistance. It is important to be precise about causes. Taxes were not crushing by European standards. Many duties were modest, and some were repealed. But the principle of taxation for revenue, without representation, struck at how colonists understood the constitution of the empire. Enforcement mechanisms, admiralty courts without juries, writs of assistance for searches, salaried royal officials insulated from local assemblies, amplified fears. Economic boycotts worked not merely because they pinched trade, but because they signaled social discipline and civic commitment across colonies. Equally crucial were the contradictions and limits of the colonial movement. Many colonists remained loyal throughout the crisis. Others hesitated, hoping for a negotiated settlement. On the frontier, indigenous nations calculated that neither British nor colonial victory guaranteed their lands. Some leaned toward the crown as the lesser threat to western boundaries. Enslaved people, hearing liberty's language, saw opportunities and risks. Some sought freedom through British lines later, others through revolutionary service. The road to revolution was not a single path, but a convergence of many, often in tension. By mid-1775, the constitutional debate had become a military siege. The colonies had not declared independence. They still sent petitions and professed allegiance. Yet blood had been shed, armies formed, and a continental body claimed powers no assembly had held before. What began as disputes over revenue policies and charters had become a struggle over who could legislate for a people, and on what basis. The transformation from subject to citizen would demand another turn, the articulation of independence and the forging of alliances. For now, the story ends with embattled lines around Boston, with cannon laboring south from Ticonderoga, and with a Congress discovering that, in defending their inherited liberties, the colonies had already stepped into something new. The next chapter will follow the war that tested those claims, costly, uncertain, and ultimately revolutionary. In the spring of 1775, protests became open war. After Lexington and Concord in April, New England militia ringed Boston, trapping British regulars inside a city supplied only by sea. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May, raised a Continental Army, and chose George Washington to command. Without a navy or a treasury, the colonies took their first steps toward organized resistance while still petitioning for reconciliation. The early fighting revealed both determination and limits. On June 17, 1775, colonial forces on Breed's Hill, often called Bunker Hill, repulsed 2 British assaults before being driven off for lack of ammunition. British casualties were heavy. The lesson was plain. Irregular forces, properly cited, could bloody professional troops, but supply would decide endurance. In the north, an American thrust into Canada sought to deny Britain a base. After the fall of Fort Ticonderoga in May, forces under Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold converged on Quebec, only to be repelled in a desperate assault on December 31, 1775. The invasion failed. Disease and winter ground the campaign down. Meanwhile, the British position in Boston weakened. In the winter of 1775-1776, Henry Knox led an astonishing logistical effort, hauling captured cannon from Ticonderoga across frozen terrain to the heights above Boston. On the night of March 4-5, 1776, American troops fortified Dorchester Heights. British commanders, suddenly outgunned in the harbor, evacuated Boston on March 17. The siege had ended without a decisive battle, but the war simply shifted south. Through 1776, the political center moved as well. The Olive Branch Petition had been rejected. Royal proclamations labeled the colonists rebels. Pamphlets and petitions pressed the logic of independence. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted for independence. On July 4, it approved the Declaration, announcing a people's right to alter government and listing grievances against the Crown. Within weeks, the new United States faced the world's foremost military power in earnest. Britain aimed to crush the rebellion quickly by seizing the Hudson Corridor and isolating New England. In August 1776, a massive British force landed on Long Island. Washington's army, outmaneuvered at the Battle of Long Island on August 27, retreated from Brooklyn and eventually from Manhattan and the Jerseys. By late autumn, American morale sagged. Enlistments waned. The cause looked fragile. Washington gambled. On the night of December 25-26, 1776, in a winter storm, he ferried troops across the ice-choked Delaware River, struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton at dawn, and won a sharp victory. A follow-on action at Princeton on January 3, 1777, further buoyed spirits. These were not large battles by European standards, but they restored confidence and disrupted British plans, proving the Continental Army could strike, withdraw, and live to fight again. In 1777, British strategy returned to the Hudson. General John Burgoyne advanced south from Canada with a mixed force, expecting to meet support from the west and the south. Instead, difficult terrain, long supply lines, and active American resistance slowed him. American forces under Horatio Gates, and aided decisively by Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan, contested Burgoyne near Saratoga in two battles, on September 19 and October 7, 1777. Cut off and outnumbered, Burgoyne surrendered on October 17. Saratoga was more than a battlefield success. It was a diplomatic turning point. As Burgoyne faltered, the British captured Philadelphia in September 1777 after victories at Brandywine and Germantown. Congress fled westward. Washington's army went into winter quarters at Valley Forge. The winter of 1777-1778 became a shorthand for hardship, cold, disease, poor clothing, and supply breakdowns. Yet it was also the crucible of professionalization. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer, drilled the troops, standardizing movements, sanitation, and camp routines. When the army left Valley Forge, it was leaner, better trained, and more cohesive. Abroad, American diplomats capitalized on Saratoga. In early 1778, the United States and France concluded treaties of amity and alliance. France recognized American independence and entered the war, sending fleets and later, troops under the Comte de Rochambeau. The conflict widened into a global contest. Spain joined against Britain in 1779, and the Dutch Republic followed in 1780, detouring British resources into theaters from the Caribbean to Gibraltar to the Indian Ocean. At home, the new alliance altered military calculations. In June 1778, Washington engaged British forces withdrawing from Philadelphia at the Battle of Monmouth. Under broiling heat, the reformed Continental Line held its ground against assaults. The battle ended tactically inconclusive, but the Army's steadiness was clear. Strategically, Britain shifted its weight southward, believing that Loyalist strength and valuable ports in the Carolinas and Georgia could be leveraged to peel colonies away one by one. The Southern War began with a British success at Savannah in late 1778 and a failed Franco-American attempt to retake the city in 1779. In May 1780, Charleston fell after a long siege, delivering thousands of American prisoners and the worst defeat of the war to that point. August brought a disaster at Camden, where General Horatio Gates's army collapsed. But the Southern strategy soon encountered a stubborn fact: occupation was not control. Guerrilla warfare, shifting loyalties, and supply difficulties turned victory into attrition. American leadership in the South recalibrated. Nathanael Greene took command and adopted a war of movement, dispersing forces to stretch British lines while avoiding annihilation. Daniel Morgan's detachment struck a decisive blow at Cowpens on January 17, 1781, defeating Banastre Tarleton with deft tactics. Cornwallis pursued Greene into North Carolina, clashing at Guilford Courthouse on March 15, 1781. The British held the field but at heavy cost, prompting Cornwallis to move toward the Virginia Tidewater to refit and seek naval support. The war also raged on other frontiers. In the Ohio Valley, George Rogers Clark led expeditions that captured Kaskaskia, 1778, and Vincennes, 1779, weakening British influence among Western posts. In 1779, the Sullivan expedition marched against Iroquois towns allied with Britain, destroying crops and settlements to curb raids. The campaign devastated communities and underscored the war's civil and interethnic dimensions. Within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy itself, divisions were acute. The Oneida and Tuscarora tended to support the Americans. Other nations largely sided with the Crown. On the seas, Britain's navy remained formidable, but American privateers harried commerce, and Allied fleets contested control. John Paul Jones's battle in 1779 between Bonhomme Richard and HMS Serapis, ending with the British ship's capture, became emblematic of audacity at sea. French and Spanish operations drew British squadrons into a worldwide chess match, easing pressure on American coasts and, critically, setting the stage for a decisive naval moment in 1781. Social and political strains threaded through the conflict. Loyalists, Americans who remained faithful to the Crown, formed militias, took refuge with British forces, or fled abroad. Patriots sometimes enacted confiscations or reprisals, and civil violence scarred communities. For enslaved people, the war offered peril and opportunity. Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775 and the British Philipsburg Proclamation in 1779 promised freedom to those who left rebel masters to serve the Crown. Thousands sought British lines, while others gained freedom through American service or post-war manumission. At war's end, many black loyalists were evacuated to Nova Scotia and other parts of the empire, carrying with them freedom papers and complex memories of allegiance and survival. Financing the war tested the new polity. Congress, operating under the Articles of Confederation, approved in 1777, fully ratified in 1781, lacked power to tax directly. It relied on requisitions to states, foreign loans, especially from France and, via Dutch financiers, the Netherlands, and the work of officials like Robert Morris to stabilize credit. Continental currency depreciated severely, giving rise to the phrase, "not worth a continental." Even so, the army persisted, fed by a mix of state levies, French aid, and endurance. The most dramatic turn came in 1781, when Allied coordination achieved what neither side alone had done before. Cornwallis entrenched at Yorktown, Virginia, confident that the Royal Navy would ensure mobility and supply. Washington, long fixated on New York, seized an opportunity after French Admiral de Grasse sailed north with a powerful fleet. In a rapid march, Washington and Rochambeau shifted the main Allied army south from the Hudson to Virginia, masking the movement with feints. The naval hinge turned on September 5, 1781, at the Battle of the Chesapeake, also called the Battle of the Virginia Capes. De Grasse's fleet engaged a British squadron under Thomas Graves and drove it off. No ships were lost, but the British were compelled to withdraw for repairs, ceding temporary control of the bay to France. With the Chesapeake closed, Cornwallis was trapped. Allied forces began a formal siege, digging parallel trenches, moving heavy guns forward, and methodically battering British defenses. Night assaults captured key outworks, redoubts 9 and 10, after which Allied artillery enfiladed the British lines. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. Yorktown did not end all fighting. Skirmishes and operations continued overseas and in frontier zones, but it broke the political will in London to continue a costly war that had widened into a global conflict. Parliamentary opposition gained strength. Negotiations began. Peace talks in Paris stretched across 1782 and 1783. American negotiators, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and later, Henry Lawrence, balanced alliance obligations to France with the need to secure favorable terms from Britain. Preliminary articles were signed on November 30, 1782. The definitive Treaty of Paris was concluded on September 3, 1783. Britain recognized the independence of the United States and set boundaries extending to the Mississippi River, with access to fisheries off Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. The treaty addressed debts and recommended, but did not compel, the restitution of Loyalist property. Other treaties settled matters among Britain, France, and Spain. The transition from war to peace was fraught. The army, long unpaid, grew restless. Officers at Newburgh in 1783 voiced grievances in a moment that could have turned dangerous. Washington diffused the crisis with a carefully measured appeal to duty and civilian supremacy, reminding officers of the cause they had served. Over the months that followed, British forces evacuated key posts, including New York in November 1783, as Loyalists departed into exile. In December, Washington resigned his commission before Congress at Annapolis, returning power to civilian hands. The revolution shaped more than borders. It launched a debate about Republican governance that would continue through the 1780s and beyond. How to balance liberty and order, majority rule and minority rights, local autonomy and national purpose. It reshaped Native American geopolitics by removing an imperial buffer, accelerating U.S. expansion into contested territories. It intensified the contradiction between the language of natural rights and the persistence of slavery, an issue some states addressed by gradual emancipation in the North, while others entrenched bondage in the South. It elevated ideas of civic equality for white men, widened participation, and laid cultural expectations for virtue and public service, even as property, race, and gender boundaries persisted. Myths flourish around revolutions, but the record shows a complicated, contingent struggle. American victory rested on multiple pillars: a resilient political idea, the legitimacy of government by consent, a continental army that survived defeats and learned to fight a European-style line, local and state mobilization that persisted through hardship, and international alliances that delivered naval supremacy at decisive moments. British defeats owed as much to global overextension and the limits of occupation as to any single battle lost. The revolution's timeline, from embattled fields at Lexington to formal recognition in Paris, ran only 8 years, but its consequences were generational. The war forged continental networks, common experiences, and a vocabulary of rights. It left wartime debts and unsettled disputes to the next decade's constitutional debates. It also left a template, imperfect and contested, for how a new people might organize themselves without a king. When the guns fell silent, the work of nation-building began. Soldiers went home to farms and shops, some to poverty, some to opportunity on new frontiers. Black Loyalists sailed for Nova Scotia, Sierra Leone, and other destinations, carrying certificates of freedom. Native nations confronted an expanding republic that claimed, on paper, lands never ceded. Women who had sustained households and communities during the war pressed, in published letters and private conversations, for greater acknowledgement in civic life. The story of independence thus ended not with finality, but with questions about inclusion, justice, and the reach of revolutionary promises. Looking back from 1783, one sees not inevitability but a chain of choices and accidents. A nighttime crossing in a winter storm, a surrendered army in northern forests, a French fleet arriving at precisely the right moment, and an American general who, when he might have taken power, handed his sword back to the people's representatives. From these contingencies emerged a republic whose future chapters would test whether the ideals written in 1776 could be made real for all. The War for Independence ended in 1783, but the work of creating a durable republic had only begun. The United States emerged with a weak central government under the Articles of Confederation. No executive, no independent judiciary, and no direct taxing power. Congress could make treaties and wage war, but it relied on voluntary contributions from the states. Debt pressed hard, currencies fluctuated, and Western boundaries, though widened on paper by the Treaty of Paris, remained contested on the ground. Even amid institutional weakness, Congress took consequential steps for the West. The Land Ordinance of 1785 set a survey system of rectangular townships that still shapes the landscape. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 outlined a path from territorial status to statehood for lands north of the Ohio River, guaranteed certain civil liberties, and prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory. These measures sketched a Republican answer to empire. New states admitted as equals, not colonies kept subordinate. The limits of the Articles soon became undeniable. In 1786-1787, farmers in western Massachusetts, facing taxes, debt suits, and foreclosures, mobilized in what became known as Shays' Rebellion. They aimed to shut down courts. State militia restored order, but the episode alarmed elites across the states. Disorder at home, British forts still on the Great Lakes, Spanish closure of the Mississippi to American trade, and a chronic revenue crisis convinced many leaders that the Confederation needed reform. Delegates met in Philadelphia in 1787, expecting to revise the Articles. They drafted a new constitution instead. The convention produced a stronger federal framework, a bicameral legislature, a single executive, a federal judiciary, enumerated powers including taxation, regulation of interstate and foreign commerce and war-making, and checks and balances across branches. Compromises resolved representation, the Great Compromise blending population-based and state-based chambers, and entwined slavery with the new order. The Three-Fifths Compromise affected apportionment. A fugitive slave clause bound states to return escapees, and Congress could not ban the transatlantic slave trade before 1808. Ratification required persuasion. The Federalist Papers, essays by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, argued that an extended republic could control factions, and that separated powers could guard liberty while enabling effective government. Anti-Federalists warned of consolidated power, distant rulers, and insufficient protections for individual rights. The Constitution won ratification in state conventions across 1787-1788, with a critical promise to add a Bill of Rights quickly. The new government convened in 1789. George Washington took the oath in New York City. Congress created executive departments and the federal courts through the Judiciary Act of 1789. By 1791, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights were ratified, protecting speech, press, religion, assembly, due process, and the right to bear arms, among others. The Republic had a legal skeleton. It needed sinew, finances, credit, and habits of administration to move. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton advanced an ambitious financial program. He proposed federal assumption of state revolutionary debts, funding the national debt at par to establish credit, an excise tax for revenue, and a national bank to stabilize currency and anchor public finance. A compromise placed the permanent national capital on the Potomac, while assumption moved forward. The Bank of the United States, chartered in 1791, sparked constitutional debate. Strict constructionists doubted Congress's power to create it. Hamilton defended implied powers under the necessary and proper clause. These policies helped steady the nation's credit, but sharpened political lines. Differing visions, commercial and urban versus agrarian and decentralized, coalesced into the first party system, Federalists around Washington and Hamilton, Democratic Republicans around Jefferson and Madison. Partisanship expressed real policy disagreements and different readings of the Revolution's meaning. Foreign policy complicated everything. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, entangled American sympathies and interests. Washington declared neutrality in 1793 amid European war, seeking to keep the fragile republic out of a conflict between Britain and revolutionary France. British seizures of neutral American ships and their continued presence in Western forts strained relations. Jay's Treaty, negotiated in 1794, ratified in 1795, secured British evacuation of those forts and a framework for trade, but conceded little on impressment. Critics saw it as too conciliatory. Pinckney's treaty with Spain, 1795, defined the Florida boundary and, crucially, opened the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans to American commerce. Domestic tensions flared in the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, when Western Pennsylvania farmers, angered by the federal excise tax on distilled spirits, resisted enforcement. Washington, insisting that Republican government must command obedience to law, led militia toward the region. The resistance dispersed. The show of force established a precedent. The federal government would use lawful means to execute its statutes while also employing clemency carefully thereafter. Washington's farewell address in 1796 warned against permanent foreign entanglements and excessive party spirit. John Adams, a Federalist, won the presidency that year. Thomas Jefferson became vice president under the original electoral rules. Adams's term was dominated by the XYZ Affair, 1797, in which French intermediaries demanded loans and bribes to begin negotiations over maritime disputes. Outrage at home fueled a quasi-war, an undeclared naval conflict with France. American frigates and privateers fought French ships in the Caribbean. Diplomacy eventually prevailed with the Convention of 1800, restoring peace. The domestic costs of crisis were high. In 1798, the Federalist Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, lengthening naturalization periods, empowering the president to detain or deport certain non-citizens, and criminalizing false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. Democratic Republicans condemned these measures as assaults on liberty. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, drafted in part by Madison and Jefferson, asserted that states could judge the constitutionality of federal laws, though the resolutions carried no binding legal force. The acts proved politically costly to Federalists. The election of 1800, sometimes called the Revolution of 1800, produced the first peaceful transfer of power between rival parties in modern history. Electoral complications threw the Jefferson-Burr tie to the House. After protracted balloting, Jefferson became president and Burr vice president. The 12th Amendment, ratified in 1804, later separated votes for president and vice president to prevent a repeat. The judiciary emerged as a co-equal branch under Chief Justice John Marshall, appointed in early 1801, in Marbury v. Madison, 1803. The Supreme Court asserted judicial review, the power to declare federal laws unconstitutional, by refusing to issue a writ beyond the court's original jurisdiction, but affirming the principle that the Constitution is supreme law. This decision clarified the judiciary's role without precipitating a showdown with the executive. Jefferson's administration pursued limited government at home and opportunity through land. In 1803, the United States purchased Louisiana from France, doubling the nation's territory and securing control of the Mississippi River and New Orleans. The purchase raised constitutional questions. Jefferson himself had once favored strict construction, but he accepted implied power for this strategic acquisition. The Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1804-1806, aided by numerous native guides in the presence of Sacagawea, mapped routes, cataloged flora and fauna, and opened diplomatic relations, while acknowledging in journals the sovereignty of the nations they met, sovereignty that U.S. expansion would soon erode. On distant shores, the young republic asserted maritime rights. The First Barbary War, 1801-1805, challenged North African corsair states that demanded tribute from shipping in the Mediterranean. After mixed naval and marine operations, including the burning of the captured frigate Philadelphia in Tripoli Harbor, the U.S. negotiated peace that reduced payments. A second conflict in 1815 reinforced the message that American commerce would sail without tribute. The economy and society transformed unevenly. In 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin made seed removal far more efficient for short-staple cotton, enabling rapid expansion of cotton cultivation across the Deep South. This innovation, combined with demand from British and New England textile mills and new Western lands, supercharged slavery's growth. After Congress banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, as the Constitution allowed, the domestic slave trade expanded, moving tens of thousands of enslaved people from the Upper South to the cotton frontier. Families separated, communities uprooted, profits multiplied. Native nations faced constant pressure. After General Anthony Wayne's victory over a native confederation at Fallen Timbers in 1794, the Treaty of Greenville, 1795, ceded large tracts in the Ohio country. New confederacies and leaders arose. Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, the Prophet, urged resistance and cultural renewal in the early 1810s. Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison's forces clashed with the Prophet's town at Tippecanoe in 1811, an indecisive battle with decisive political effects, hardening lines as larger war approached. Jefferson's second term reeled from European conflict. Britain and France, locked in the Napoleonic Wars, restricted neutral trade. Britain's impressment of American sailors stoked anger. The Embargo Act of 1807 halted most foreign trade to pressure Britain and France. Instead, it battered American merchants and seafarers. Modified measures followed, but the damage to Jefferson's popularity was real, and enforcement proved fraught. James Madison took office in 1809. Diplomatic experiments like Macon's Bill No. 2 sought to leverage trade to restore neutral rights. Frustrations, frontier violence, and political momentum among war hawks in Congress converged. In June 1812, the United States declared war on Britain. The War of 1812 featured early failed invasions of Canada, victories at sea by American frigates, and intense fighting on the Great Lakes. Oliver Hazard Perry's 1813 victory on Lake Erie, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," secured control of the lake and enabled success at the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh fell, shattering elements of his Confederacy. The war's darkest hour came in 1814. After Napoleon's initial defeat in Europe, Britain sent veterans to North America. In August, British forces captured Washington, D.C., and burned public buildings, including the Capitol and the President's house. An attempted assault on Baltimore stalled. The bombardment of Fort McHenry inspired Francis Scott Key's poem that later became the national anthem. On the Northern Front, American forces fought the British to a standstill around Plattsburgh. Diplomats in Ghent concluded a peace in December 1814, restoring pre-war boundaries with no clear victor but ending hostilities, and with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the impressment crisis. News traveled slowly. On January 8, 1815, Andrew Jackson's militia, regulars, and allies defeated a British assault at New Orleans. A spectacular victory that came after the treaty, but powerfully shaped public memory and Jackson's rise. The war's legacies were paradoxical. The U.S. failed to conquer Canada and did not secure explicit concessions on maritime issues, yet it emerged with enhanced confidence, weakened native resistance in the old Northwest and Southeast, and a political opposition, the Federalist Party, discredited by the Hartford Convention's perceived flirtation with disunion. The Democratic Republicans dominated national politics, and the nation turned inward to growth. The post-war years saw investment in transportation and early industry. Turnpikes and canals, like New York's Erie Canal, chartered in 1817 and under construction, promised to connect interior farms to Atlantic markets. Protective tariffs in 1816 aided budding manufacturers. Banks proliferated, extending credit to settlers and entrepreneurs. These threads, market expansion, finance, mobility, wove the early fabric of the market revolution. James Monroe's presidency, beginning in 1817, is often labeled the era of good feelings because national political competition receded as the Federalists faded. The label overstates consensus. Regional interests and the question of slavery's expansion simmered. Still, Monroe toured the country, symbolizing unity, while his administration consolidated borders. The First Seminole War, 1817–1818, saw U.S. forces under Andrew Jackson pursue Seminole groups and runaway slaves into Spanish Florida, seizing posts and provoking diplomatic friction. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams leveraged the crisis. The Adams-Honest Treaty of 1819 transferred Florida to the United States and fixed the boundary with Spanish territory to the Pacific, ceding American claims to Texas in exchange for Spain's recognition of U.S. claims to Oregon Country with Britain unresolved. The Supreme Court under Chief Justice Marshall shaped constitutional meaning. In McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819, the court upheld the constitutionality of the national bank and denied states the power to tax federal institutions, affirming a broad view of implied powers and federal supremacy. In Dartmouth College v. Woodward, 1819, the court protected corporate charters as contracts, signaling a legal environment supportive of commerce and enterprise. These decisions strengthened national institutions while encouraging economic development. Social life, religion, and reform stirred beneath politics. The Second Great Awakening, revivals that began in the 1790s and spread through the 1810s, encouraged personal conversion, camp meetings, and new denominations' growth. The movement energized voluntary associations for missions, temperance, and charity. Women, often excluded from formal politics, organized and led many of these efforts, building networks and skills they would later channel into anti-slavery and women's rights activism. In the North, gradual emancipation laws passed after the Revolution took effect unevenly across these decades. In the South, slavery deepened with cotton spread. The Haitian Revolution, 1791–1804, reverberated across American shores. It helped persuade Napoleon to sell Louisiana and stirred terror among slaveholders while inspiring free black communities. Gabriel's planned rebellion near Richmond in 1800, discovered and suppressed, led southern states to tighten restrictions. The domestic slave trade's growth after 1808, visible in chained coffles moving south and southwest, etched a human geography of expansion and suffering that underwrote national prosperity. Western settlement accelerated. New states entered from the Trans-Appalachian West: Kentucky, 1792, Tennessee, 1796, Ohio, 1803, Louisiana, 1812, Indiana, 1816, Mississippi, 1817, Illinois, 1818, and Alabama, 1819. Each admission sharpened the arithmetic of sectional balance in the Senate and raised the question: would slavery expand with the flag? That question could no longer be deferred by 1819, when Missouri applied for statehood with slavery legal. The Missouri crisis tested the Union's capacity for compromise. In 1819, Representative James Tallmadge proposed restricting the further introduction of slaves into Missouri and providing for gradual emancipation, measures the House passed and the Senate blocked. Months of fierce debate followed, revealing stark sectional lines. The eventual Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state, Maine, separated from Massachusetts, as a free state to preserve the Senate balance, and prohibited slavery in the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory north of 36 degrees 30 latitude, except Missouri itself. The compromise secured a temporary peace but drew a line across the map, a warning that the Republic was, beneath goodwill, divided. By 1820, the United States had traveled far from the fragile Confederation of 1783. It possessed a written constitution tested in courts, a fiscal system that had survived war and panic, expanding borders secured by diplomacy, and a political tradition that could transfer power peacefully. It also carried burdens: a continental project built on native dispossession, an economy enriched by enslaved labor, and sectional tensions made visible by Missouri's admission. The Republic's triumphs, territory, law, and markets, were real. So were its contradictions. Building a republic meant more than drafting a charter. It meant inventing practices. Citizens learned to vote in wider numbers of states, read newspapers in proliferating towns, and argue policies in taverns, churches, and courtrooms. Office holders navigated precedent where none existed, interpreting silence as space to act or limits to respect. The United States was, in these years, both a government and a school in self-government, teaching itself, through conflict and compromise, how to be a nation. The decades ahead would widen every question. Canals and factories would quicken change. New territories would beckon. Reformers would insist that the nation live up to its ideals. But in 1820, the foundation was set. A federal union strong enough to survive war, flexible enough to grow, and divided enough to make the future uncertain. The story of building a republic ends here, for now, with a map larger than anyone in 1783 imagined, with the Constitution carrying both liberty's promise and slavery's stain, and with a people still deciding what the revolution had truly begun. Between 1820 and 1860, the United States expanded its borders across a continent while fracturing politically and morally over slavery. The period's central dynamic was simple to state and complex to resolve. Each new mile of territory raised the question of whether slavery would follow the flag. Economic transformation, mass migration, and religious revivals complicated the picture, but again and again politics circled back to the map and to human bondage at the nation's core. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 set the opening terms. Congress admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state to preserve the Senate's sectional balance, then barred slavery in the remaining Louisiana Purchase north of latitude 36 degrees 30, except Missouri. This bargain calmed immediate tensions and drew an east-west line across the continent, an armistice in law that future events would test and eventually overturn. Expansion ran parallel to economic change. The Erie Canal, opened in 1825, linked the Great Lakes to the Atlantic via the Hudson River. Costs of moving bulk goods plummeted. Midwestern grain and timber flowed to New York. Manufactured goods moved inland. Upstate towns boomed. New York City overtook rivals as the nation's commercial capital. Steamboats multiplied on western rivers, and by the 1840s railroads, cheaper to lay than canals and less constrained by winter, began to knit regional markets. The telegraph, first demonstrated in 1844, allowed news and prices to leap across distances at near-instant speed. Industrialization gathered first in New England's textiles. The Lowell system recruited young women to mill work under boarding house rules and fixed schedules. Wages and conditions became contentious as competition intensified and immigrant labor rose. Early strikes and the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association signaled emergent labor politics. In the Mid-Atlantic, iron, coal, and machine shops expanded. In the West, mechanization via John Deere's steel plow, 1837, and Cyrus McCormick's reaper increased agricultural output, tying farms to urban markets. The Cotton Kingdom spread south and west. Short staple cotton, ginned efficiently and demanded by British and northern mills, surged through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, eastern Texas, and Arkansas. After the U.S. banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, a domestic trade grew. Enslaved people were sold from Chesapeake and Carolina plantations to the Deep South in forced migrations that broke families and remade communities. Cotton exports underwrote national growth. The profits were inseparable from coerced labor and the violence that sustained it. Politics shifted with mass participation. The 1820s saw property qualifications for white male voters fall in many states, producing higher turnout and sharper party competition. Andrew Jackson's election in 1828 marked the rise of a new Democratic coalition that championed rotation in office, suspicion of centralized finance, and a vision of the republic rooted in independent producers. Opponents coalesced as Whigs, favoring a stronger federal role in economic development, banks, tariffs, and internal improvements. Foreign policy ideas framed expansion. The Monroe Doctrine, 1823, warned European powers against recolonization in the Americas. It promised U.S. non-interference in European affairs while asserting a hemispheric interest. At home, the United States, expansion remained entangled with native nations whose sovereignty and land stood in the way of settler demand. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, authorizing treaties to exchange eastern lands for territory west of the Mississippi. Although the Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, recognized Cherokee sovereignty against state intrusion, removal continued under federal authority and pressure. The Cherokee, along with other southeastern peoples, were forced west in the late 1830s. The Cherokee Trail of Tears in 1839 cost thousands of lives. Seminoles resisted in Florida, Second Seminole War, 1835–1842, fighting a costly conflict that demonstrated both indigenous resilience and U.S. determination. Sectional controversy flared in the nullification crisis. Protective tariffs, particularly the 1828 Tariff of Abominations, angered South Carolina politicians who argued that states could nullify unconstitutional federal laws. John C. Calhoun articulated the doctrine. Andrew Jackson rejected it decisively. In 1832-1833, Congress passed a force bill authorizing federal coercion, while Henry Clay brokered a compromise tariff. The crisis ended without violence, but it revealed a pattern. States' rights arguments would increasingly be deployed in defense of slavery. The bank war further polarized politics. Jackson opposed the Second Bank of the United States, denouncing it as a privileged monopoly. When Congress rechartered the bank in 1832, Jackson vetoed. After re-election, he removed federal deposits to selected state pet banks. The bank's demise shifted credit into less regulated channels. A speculative land boom followed, then the Panic of 1837, and a long depression that battered wages and prices. Economic shocks deepened ideological divides over how much the federal government should stabilize markets. Westward migration accelerated. The Oregon Trail carried families across the plains to the Willamette Valley. The Oregon boundary with Britain was peacefully settled in 1846 along the 49th parallel, extending the northern border to the Pacific. Meanwhile, events in Texas moved toward war. American settlers in Mexican Texas, tensions over Mexico's centralizing policies, and slavery's status culminated in the Texas Revolution of 1835-1836. After defeats at the Alamo and Goliad and victory at San Jacinto, Texas became an independent republic seeking annexation to the United States. Annexation was delayed because it threatened sectional balance, but in 1845, the United States admitted Texas. Border disputes with Mexico over the Nueces Strip and the Rio Grande led to war in 1846. The Mexican-American War unfolded on multiple fronts. U.S. forces under Zachary Taylor fought in northern Mexico. Winfield Scott led an amphibious landing at Veracruz and a campaign to Mexico City. In the West, U.S. troops and Allied settlers secured California and New Mexico. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 ended the war, with Mexico ceding a vast territory. Today's California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, and the United States paying $15 million and assuming certain claims. Victory reopened the core question: would slavery extend into the new lands? The Wilmot Proviso of 1846, which sought to bar slavery from any territory acquired from Mexico, repeatedly passed the House and failed in the Senate. The debate introduced a potent principle, free soil, that argued Western lands should be reserved for free labor. Southern leaders, by contrast, pressed constitutional claims to carry property, including enslaved people, into the territories. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 brought a global rush in 1849. Rapid population growth propelled California's bid for statehood as a free state, threatening Senate balance. The Compromise of 1850, engineered by Henry Clay and guided through Congress by Stephen Douglas, attempted to settle matters. California entered as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah would be organized with popular sovereignty, allowing settlers to vote on slavery. The slave trade, but not slavery, ended in the District of Columbia. And a new, stricter Fugitive Slave Act required free state officials and citizens to assist in the capture of escapees, and denied accused fugitives a jury trial. The Fugitive Slave Act nationalized slavery's enforcement and ignited Northern resistance. Personal liberty laws in several states sought to protect free black residents from kidnapping and to ensure due process. Dramatic renditions, like that of Anthony Burns in Boston, 1854, provoked mass protests. The Underground Railroad, an informal network of black and white activists, aided escapes to Canada. Harriet Tubman's repeated journeys symbolized both courage and community coordination. In court, Prigg v. Pennsylvania, 1842, had already limited states' roles in enforcing fugitive returns. After 1850, conflicts intensified between federal authority and local conscience. Print and persuasion amplified the moral argument. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, depicted slavery's human costs and reached readers across the Atlantic. Southern writers and politicians increasingly articulated a positive good defense of slavery, with Calhoun among its most lucid advocates. The public sphere sorted into anti-slavery coalitions, from radical immediatists like William Lloyd Garrison, who launched the Liberator in 1831, to political abolitionists and free soil advocates who prioritized stopping slavery's extension. Immigration transformed Northern society. In the late 1840s and 1850s, famine in Ireland and political upheaval in the German states sent hundreds of thousands to American ports. Cities swelled, ethnic neighborhoods and Catholic parishes grew, nativist sentiment surged. The American, or Know Nothing, party channeled anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic anxieties into electoral gains mid-decade before fragmenting over slavery. The Missouri Compromise's geographic truce collapsed with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Seeking a transcontinental railroad route and local autonomy in the territories. Stephen Douglas proposed organizing Kansas and Nebraska on the basis of popular sovereignty, and explicitly repealed the 36 degrees 30 ban north of the line. The act passed, the political system convulsed. The Whig Party disintegrated. Anti-slavery Whigs, Free Soilers, and some Northern Democrats coalesced as the Republican Party, dedicated to preventing slavery's spread. Kansas became a proving ground. Pro- and anti-slavery settlers rushed in. Violence followed. In 1856, pro-slavery forces sacked the anti-slavery town of Lawrence. John Brown and followers retaliated with killings at Pottawatomie Creek. Competing territorial governments formed at Lecompton, pro-slavery, and Topeka, Free State. Congress debated which constitution to recognize. Ultimately, Kansas's admission as a free state was delayed until 1861, but the territory's turmoil previewed national fracture. The caning of Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor in 1856, after he denounced the slave power, dramatized the collapse of legislative comedy. Sectional identity hardened as newspapers, parties, and churches split along regional lines. The idea that compromise could always rescue the Union looked less certain each year. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857 deepened the crisis. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for freedom on the grounds of residence in free territory. Chief Justice Roger Taney's opinion held that black people, free or enslaved, could not be citizens of the United States for purposes of federal court jurisdiction, and declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional by asserting Congress lacked authority to ban slavery in the territories. For many Northerners, the ruling looked like a sweeping victory for slavery's expansion. For Southerners, it affirmed constitutional protections they claimed. The decision undermined popular sovereignty's premise and pushed politics toward irreconcilability. Economic shock returned with the Panic of 1857, driven by declining international demand, overexpansion of railroads, and financial instability. The downturn hit the North harder than the South, reinforcing a Southern belief in cotton's relative security, King Cotton, and a Northern conviction that free labor needed protective policies, including tariffs and homestead laws. The policy gap was also a values gap. Republicans framed the nation's future as one of free soil and upward mobility. Democrats increasingly split along sectional lines. The Lincoln, Douglas' debates of 1858 in Illinois clarified choices for a national audience. Stephen Douglas defended popular sovereignty with his Freeport Doctrine, arguing that local police power could practically bar slavery despite Dred Scott. Abraham Lincoln insisted that the nation could not endure half slave and half free without choosing a direction. He did not call for immediate abolition where slavery already existed, but insisted Congress must halt its spread. Douglas kept his Senate seat. Lincoln gained national stature and a clear platform. John Brown reappeared in 1859 at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, leading a small band to seize the federal arsenal and spark a slave uprising. The raid failed. Brown was captured and executed. In the South, the plot confirmed fears of Northern-backed insurrection. In parts of the North, Brown's steadfastness under trial and gallows earned admiration. The space for mutual trust narrowed. Throughout these decades, free black communities in the North grew, building churches, schools, and mutual aid societies, while facing discrimination, mob violence, and legal barriers. In the South, a minority of free people of color navigated a precarious legal status. Across the nation, black activists, among them Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Henry Highland Garnet, spoke, wrote, and organized, insisting that American ideals must include them. Reform movements reshaped civic life. The Second Great Awakening inspired temperance campaigns, educational reforms under figures like Horace Mann, and efforts to improve prisons and asylums led by Dorothea Dix. Women's rights activists, emerging from anti-slavery circles, gathered at Seneca Falls in 1848 to issue the Declaration of Sentiments, asserting that the equality promised in national founding documents applied to women as well. These movements did not resolve sectional conflict, but they broadened the meaning of citizenship and conscience. U.S. borders continued to adjust at the margins. The Gadsden Purchase of 1853 added a strip of land in present-day southern Arizona and New Mexico, facilitating a potential southern transcontinental railroad. Expansionist schemes like the Ostend Manifesto, 1854, which suggested U.S. acquisition of Cuba, aroused northern suspicion of a pro-slavery foreign policy. Private filibustering expeditions, such as William Walker's brief rule in Nicaragua, embarrassed the United States and further polarized debate. By 1860, the political map had realigned. Republicans dominated across much of the North on a platform of halting slavery's extension, supporting internal improvements, free homesteads, and protective tariffs. Democrats split into northern and southern wings over the territorial question. Constitutional Unionists tried to rally voters around vague promises of national harmony. The electorate faced not just a contest of parties but incompatible futures. To understand why the nation stood on the brink, it helps to separate myths from structure. The conflict was not caused by abstract misunderstandings alone. It was rooted in the material and legal facts of an expanding slave economy and the constitutionally fraught system that protected it. Each compromise over new lands deferred, but did not settle the question of slavery's place in a growing republic. Economic modernization in the North and the deepening cotton regime in the South pulled regions in different directions. The rise of mass politics gave voice to those differences more clearly and more explosively than before. Yet Americans across the regions also shared experiences. Newspapers carried the same headlines. The telegraph shrank distances. Railroads sped travel. Cities like Chicago and St. Louis grew as gateways. Migrants from Europe and from eastern states remade local cultures. These forces might have knit the sections together. Instead, because the law of the land wrapped property and person in slavery, national growth multiplied points of friction. The period closes with tensions high, institutions strained, and hopes for another grand compromise fading. The next part will pick up with the election of 1860 and the secession crisis, when decades of expansion and division culminated in a war that tested whether the Union, now continental in reach, could survive the contradictions it had carried since its beginning. In the winter of 1860-1861, the long struggle over slavery and the Union broke into open fracture. Abraham Lincoln's election in November 1860, on a platform opposing slavery's expansion, was followed by the secession of South Carolina in December, and by early 1861, of 6 more Deep South states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, who organized the Confederate States of America at Montgomery, Alabama. After hostilities began, 4 Upper South states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined them. 4 slave states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union as border states. War opened at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. On April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries fired. After a day and a half of bombardment, the U.S. garrison surrendered. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Both sides mobilized rapidly, expecting a short conflict. Those hopes died at the First Battle of Bull Run, 1st Manassas, in July 1861, where Confederate forces under Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard routed Union troops near Manassas Junction. The scale of the task became clear. This would be an extended, industrial-age war requiring mass armies, logistics, and national will. Strategy took shape early. Union planners envisioned a broad Anaconda Plan, a naval blockade to squeeze Southern commerce, control of the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy, and sustained offensive to seize critical rail hubs and cities. The Confederacy aimed to defend its territory, inflict costs that would sap Northern resolve, and seek diplomatic recognition from Britain and France, which depended on cotton but watched U.S. grain and anti-slavery politics with care. Early 1862 brought important Union gains in the West. Ulysses S. Grant captured Forts Henry and Donelson on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, opening the heartland. At Shiloh in April, ghastly 2-day fighting signaled a new scale of casualties. At sea and on rivers, technology altered warfare. The Union blockade tightened, though never perfect. In March 1862, ironclads clashed in Hampton Roads when the Confederate Virginia, rebuilt from USS Merrimack, dueled the Union's USS Monitor. The battle ended without a decisive sinking, but proved wooden fleets obsolete and shielded the blockade's core. Along the Mississippi, Union fleets supported combined operations. By April 1862, New Orleans fell to Admiral David G. Farragut, dealing a major economic and symbolic blow to the Confederacy. In the East, the Peninsula Campaign of Summer 1862 saw Union General George B. McClellan drive up Virginia's peninsula toward Richmond, only to be repulsed in the 7 days' battles by Robert E. Lee, who had assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee then carried the war north in the Maryland Campaign. On September 17, 1862, at Antietam near Sharpsburg, the two armies fought the bloodiest single day in American history. Tactical results were mixed. Strategically, Lee withdrew. The Union's defensive success gave Lincoln the moment he needed to reframe the war's purpose. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be, thenceforward and forever free, on January 1, 1863. The proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people. It exempted loyal border states and areas under Union control. Yet it transformed the conflict into a war for union and freedom, undermined Confederate labor, discouraged European intervention on the Confederacy's behalf, and authorized the enlistment of black men in the Union Armed Forces. United States Colored Troops, USCT, entered the ranks in 1863, eventually numbering nearly 180,000 soldiers and almost 20,000 sailors. They garrisoned posts, fought in major engagements, from Fort Wagner to the Siege of Petersburg, and suffered disproportionate casualties in some assaults. Their service was a political fact as well as a military one. Men who fought for the nation claimed a stake in its future. While their payrolls and pensions supported families building lives from bondage to citizenship. The war's pivotal summer came in 1863. In the West, Grant's siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi, last Confederate stronghold on the river, ended with surrender on July 4, giving the Union control of the Mississippi and splitting the Confederacy. In the East, Lee's second northern invasion collided with George G. Meade's Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1-3. After brutal fighting on Cemetery Ridge and the Round Tops and the repulse of Pickett's charge, Lee retreated to Virginia. The campaign cost tens of thousands of casualties. Combined with Vicksburg, it marked a strategic turning point. Total war's pressures mounted on civilians. The Union blockade strangled Southern trade. Inflation soared, shortages rippled. In the North, the first national drafts in 1863 triggered resistance, most violently the New York City draft riots in July, where racialized mob attacks targeted black residents and abolitionist institutions until federal troops restored order. Women shouldered farm and factory work, ran households in the absence of men, and organized relief. The U.S. Sanitary Commission professionalized wartime nursing and camp hygiene. Dorothea Dix and Clara Barton became emblematic of civilian mobilization. Field hospitals improved survival rates, even as diseases like dysentery and typhoid killed more soldiers than bullets. 1864-1865 brought coordinated Union offensives designed to exhaust Confederate capacity. Grant, promoted to General-in-Chief, traveled east to accompany the Army of the Potomac against Lee. The Overland Campaign, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, devoured men in dense fighting, but Grant kept moving, crossing the James River to besiege Petersburg's railroad hub. In the West, William T. Sherman took Atlanta in September 1864 and then launched his march to the sea, a campaign of destruction against Confederate infrastructure and war-making capacity, reaching Savannah in December before turning north through the Carolinas. These blows, alongside Philip Sheridan's devastation of the Shenandoah Valley, crippled Confederate logistics and morale. Lincoln's re-election in 1864, aided by military successes and soldier votes, signaled sustained Northern commitment. In January 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, sending it to the states. It would be ratified in December, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. On April 2-3, 1865, Petersburg and Richmond fell. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, under generous terms that allowed soldiers to return home with horses and paroled dignity. Other Confederate armies capitulated in the weeks that followed. On April 14, John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln at Ford's Theater. The president died the next morning. The nation confronted victory and loss at once. Freedom arrived unevenly across wartime lines. Even before Appomattox, enslaved people had fled to Union lines as contrabands, worked for wages in some occupied areas, and created experiments in self-governance, as on the Sea Islands. The U.S. Army's presence spread emancipation. Juneteenth commemorates the June 19, 1865, announcement in Galveston, Texas, that freedom would be enforced there. The task now was to define freedom's content: land, labor, legal status, education, and political power, and to reconcile states that had waged war against the Union. Reconstruction began with shattered infrastructure, a devastated Southern economy, and 4 million people newly free. President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, favored rapid restoration of Southern governments with minimal federal conditions, beyond ratifying the 13th Amendment and repudiating Confederate debts. Former Confederates returned to office. Southern legislatures passed black codes in 1865, 1866 to control black labor and mobility, limit access to courts and firearms, and recreate coerced dependency. Northern voters and Republicans in Congress recoiled. Congress asserted leadership. The Freedmen's Bureau, created in March 1865 within the War Department, distributed rations, negotiated labor contracts, established schools with Northern missionary societies and black teachers, and adjudicated disputes in bureau courts. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 defined national citizenship and guaranteed equal civil rights, directly countering black codes. Congress overrode Johnson's veto. The 14th Amendment, sent to the states in 1866 and ratified in 1868, constitutionalized birthright citizenship and equal protection, penalized states that denied male citizens the vote, and barred many ex-Confederate leaders from office absent congressional removal of disabilities. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 placed the former Confederacy, except Tennessee, under military districts, required new state constitutions guaranteeing black male suffrage, and conditioned readmission on ratifying the 14th Amendment. In constitutional conventions and early Reconstruction governments, multiracial coalitions, freedmen, white Southern Unionists often labeled scalawags, and Northern migrants called carpetbaggers, rewrote state charters, expanded public education, reformed taxation, and launched internal improvements. For the first time, black men held elected office at every level, from local posts to Congress. Enfranchisement culminated in the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibiting denial of the vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Yet gaining rights on paper and exercising them amid violence were different matters. Secret organizations like the Ku Klux Klan emerged by 1866-1867, using terror, whippings, arson, murder, to suppress black political participation and topple Republican governments. Congress responded with enforcement acts, 1870-1871, including the Ku Klux Klan Act, authorizing federal intervention and suspensions of habeas corpus. President Ulysses S. Grant deployed troops and federal prosecutions that temporarily curbed organized terror in parts of the South. Land and labor defined daily freedom. General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15 in early 1865 had set aside coastal lands for black settlement, symbolized as 40 acres and a mule, but post-war policy largely returned property to pre-war owners. Without land, many freed families entered sharecropping, contracting to farm owners land for a share of the crop while purchasing supplies on credit at inflated rates. Sharecropping offered autonomy in household labor and residence compared to gang labor, yet debt peonage and crop-lien systems often trapped families in cycles of poverty. Even so, black communities built churches, schools, fraternal organizations, and newspapers, creating a civil society that would sustain later generations. Reconstruction also unfolded in the courts. The Supreme Court narrowed federal protections in ways that weakened civil rights enforcement. The Slaughterhouse Cases, 1873, read the 14th Amendment's privileges or immunities clause narrowly. United States v. Cruikshank, 1876, arising from the Colfax Massacre, limited federal power to prosecute individuals for civil rights violations absent state action. These decisions, combined with waning Northern political will, left freed people more vulnerable to paramilitary violence and state-level retrenchment. National politics further undermined sustained Reconstruction. Grant's administrations vigorously defended Reconstruction in their early years, but were tarnished by scandals, such as Credit Moblier and the Whiskey Ring, that sapped moral authority. The Panic of 1873 triggered a prolonged depression, shifted attention to economic survival, and strengthened arguments for fiscal retrenchment. In the South, Redeemer Democrats organized paramilitary groups, the White League Red Shirts, and pioneered the Mississippi Plan, 1875, intimidation, ballot stuffing, and violence to overthrow Republican rule. Federal responses grew tepid as Northern voters wearied of Southern problems and prioritized economic recovery. Despite formidable obstacles, Reconstruction governments achieved durable changes. They created the South's first systems of public education, broadened social services, revised tax codes, and for a time ensured more equitable representation. Black office holders, men like Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce in the U.S. Senate, and hundreds more in state houses and city councils, demonstrated capacity and leadership. Women activists, black and white, expanded church and educational work and pressed for suffrage and legal reforms. Though the national women's suffrage movement fractured over the 15th Amendment's exclusion of sex as a protected category, violence laid bare the stakes. The 1873 Colfax Massacre in Louisiana, where a white paramilitary force killed dozens of black men defending a courthouse after a disputed election, and similar episodes across the region, signaled that political control would be contested with arms as well as ballots. Federal troop deployments and prosecutions checked some outbreaks, but could not permanently alter local power relations once Northern commitment ebbed. The election of 1876 brought the crisis to a head. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden contested a bitter campaign that ended with disputed electoral returns from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. An electoral commission awarded the contested votes to Hayes in early 1877. In understandings often labeled the Compromise of 1877, Hayes's allies signaled the end of remaining military support for Republican governments in the South and promised internal improvements. In return, Democrats acquiesced to Hayes's inauguration. Federal troops soon withdrew from the last occupied statehouses. Redeemer, Democrats consolidated power. Formal Reconstruction concluded. The struggle over its meaning continued. By 1877, slavery was abolished and the Union preserved, but the early promises of equal citizenship remained fragile. The Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th, stood as a constitutional revolution. Their enforcement would be contested for generations. The South's economy adjusted to a coarse labor system's end through tenancy, sharecropping, and industrial beginnings. The North's industrial growth accelerated, binding national markets with railroads while labor conflict rose. Native nations, meanwhile, faced intensified federal campaigns in the West during and after the war. The Civil War era's promises largely bypassed them as U.S. expansion advanced. Myths of Reconstruction, of uniform corruption or incompetent governance, obscure a more complex reality. Reconstruction was an ambitious, incomplete effort to redefine American citizenship and democracy after the destruction of slavery. It faltered under violent resistance, constitutional narrowing, economic crisis, and waning national will. Yet it left institutions, schools, churches, civic associations, and legal frameworks that future movements would claim. The civil rights struggles of the 20th century would lean heavily on the amendments and statutes born in those years. The Civil War and Reconstruction form a single arc, a nation that went to war over the survival of a union intertwined with slavery, destroyed slavery through war and law, and then struggled to build a republic consistent with freedom's demands. The cost was immense: over 600,000 soldier deaths, untold civilian suffering, and social trauma that would echo long after 1877. The achievements were profound: national reunification, emancipation, and constitutional commitments to equal citizenship. The tension between promise and practice would define the next chapters of the American story. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, the United States entered decades of extreme motion. Rail lines spiderwebbed across the continent, urban skylines climbed. Corporations grew to unprecedented scale, and millions of newcomers arrived. Historians call 1877 to about 1900 the Gilded Age, a term popularized by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner in 1873 to suggest glitter overlaying deep cracks. Extending into the early Progressive era, the story to 1910 is not only about wealth and machines. It is also about law, democracy, empire, protest, and the unequal terms on which growth unfolded. Railroads were the backbone of industrial rise. By the 1880s, the nation was laced with transcontinental links. Rates, rebates, and pooling arrangements determined who prospered from farm to factory. Financing railroads taught Wall Street how to mobilize capital at national scale. Time itself was rationalized when railroad companies standardized time zones in 1883. Towns lived or died by sidings. The steel, coal, timber, and land businesses rose in tandem. Farmers and small shippers, facing discriminatory rates and long-haul preferences, organized for redress, first in the Grange and later the Farmers' Alliances. Steel replaced iron as the industrial metal of choice. Bessemer and open hearth processes allowed mass production. Andrew Carnegie's vertically integrated operations, from ore to finished beam, drove costs down and output up. Skyscrapers emerged when steel frames met the safety elevator. Chicago's 1885 home insurance building is an early emblem. Bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge, completed 1883, signaled a new urban scale. Oil also consolidated. After the 1860s drilling booms, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil integrated refining, pipelines, and distribution, coordinating prices and squeezing competitors through rebates and trusts. Electricity changed how Americans worked and lived. Thomas Edison's Menlo Park lab commercialized incandescent lighting in 1879 and built direct current systems for neighborhoods and factories. Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse championed alternating current, better for long-distance transmission. By 1895, Niagara Falls was powering lines to Buffalo. Cities glowed at night. Factories ran more efficiently. And electric streetcars reshaped urban growth into streetcar suburbs. Offices industrialized alongside factories. Typewriters, telephones, patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. Adding machines and filing systems expanded white-collar work for men and women. Department stores and mail-order giants like Sears, Roebuck revolutionized consumption, moving goods from catalog to farmhouse by rail and wagon. Advertising became a national industry, selling brand identities as much as products. The age minted fortunes and coined new corporate forms. holding companies, trusts, and interlocking directorates concentrated control. To curb abuses, states tested regulation. The Granger laws sought to cap railroad rates. The Supreme Court upheld some state power in Munn v. Illinois, 1877, and narrowed it in Wabash, 1886, prompting Congress to create the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887, the first federal regulatory agency. The Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890, declared combinations in restraint of trade illegal, though early enforcement often targeted labor unions. In 1895, United States v. E.C. Knight limited the law's reach by distinguishing manufacturing from commerce. The legal battle over the state's power to discipline corporations had begun and would intensify in the early 1900s. Urbanization defined daily life. Between 1880 and 1910, cities swelled with migrants from farms and immigrants from abroad. Brick by brick, tenements crowded the Lower East Side. Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives, 1890, exposed conditions: overcrowding, poor light, unsafe air. Reformers responded with settlement houses. Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr founded Hull House in Chicago in 1889, offering classes, childcare, and civic research. Public health campaigns, building codes, and playgrounds were part of a wider municipal reform impulse that would feed progressive politics. Immigration transformed the cultural map. The 1880s and 1890s saw increasing arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Poles, Russian and Eastern European Jews, and others, joining earlier flows from Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia. Ellis Island opened in 1892 to process ships pouring into New York Harbor. On the Pacific coast, Chinese migrants faced mounting hostility and exclusion. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the first significant federal law to bar a nationality from immigration. Angel Island later processed Asian arrivals under harsh interrogation regimes. By 1907, a gentleman's agreement limited Japanese labor immigration. These policies reflected the era's racial hierarchy embedded in law. In the South, a different legal order hardened. After the Supreme Court's civil rights cases in 1883 gutted federal protections against private discrimination, Southern states built Jim Crow, segregation statutes regulating schools, trains, streetcars, and public accommodations. The Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, legitimated separate but equal, though facilities rarely were equal. Black voting was crushed by poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Violence, including lynching, enforced the line. Ida B. Wells, a journalist from Memphis, led an anti-lynching crusade through the 1890s, documenting atrocities and demanding federal action. Under these constraints, black communities built churches, schools, including historically black colleges, mutual aid societies, and businesses. Two prominent voices offered divergent strategies: Booker T. Washington urged vocational education and economic advancement within segregation, notably in his 1895 Atlanta Exposition address, while W.E.B. Du Bois insisted on full civil rights and higher education, helping found the Niagara Movement in 1905, and with allies, the NAACP in 1909. Work and conflict marched together. The Knights of Labor, founded earlier but surging in the mid-1880s under Terence V. Powderly, organized skilled and unskilled workers, women and men, across trades. The 1886 Haymarket bombing in Chicago, an unknown assailants bomb at a labor rally after a police clash, saw deaths on both sides and a controversial trial. Public backlash weakened the Knights. The American Federation of Labor, AFL, led by Samuel Gompers, emphasized craft unions, higher wages, and shorter hours for skilled workers. Major strikes: Homestead, 1892 at Carnegie Steel Works, crushed after gun battles with Pinkertons, and Pullman, 1894. A national railroad stoppage broken by federal injunctions and troops revealed the alignment of courts and state power against labor whenever strikes threatened interstate commerce. Farmers mobilized against the squeeze of falling commodity prices, high interest, and railroad rates. The farmers' alliances developed cooperative plans and political muscle. The People's Populist Party formed in 1892 with the Omaha Platform, calling for free silver to expand currency. A graduated income tax, government ownership or stricter regulation of railroads, and direct election of senators. In 1896, Democrat William Jennings Bryan embraced free silver with his Cross of Gold speech. Republican William McKinley, backed by robust corporate fundraising and urban votes, won on a platform of gold, standard stability, and protective tariffs. The result signaled an urban, industrial coalition's dominance, though many populist demands, senators elected by the people, regulation, would later become law. Financial crises punctuated the era. The Panic of 1893 triggered bank failures, unemployment, and breadlines. Coxey's army marched on Washington in 1894 to demand public works. McKinley's election coincided with rising gold supplies and recovery, yet the Panic of 1907 exposed system fragility again. In that crisis, private coordination centered on financier J.P. Morgan stabilized banks and trust companies, an episode that convinced many that a public central bank was needed. The Federal Reserve would arrive in 1913, just beyond our period. Imperial horizons widened in 1898. The explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, its exact cause still debated, helped propel the Spanish-American War amid cries of "Remember the Maine." U.S. forces defeated Spain in Cuba and at Manila Bay in the Philippines. Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders charged up Kettle and San Juan Hills as part of a larger campaign that relied heavily on black regiments, discipline, and firepower. The Treaty of Paris, 1898, ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Cuba became formally independent in 1902 under the Platt Amendment's constraints. In the Philippines, a brutal war, 1899–1902, with violence persisting after, followed as Filipino nationalists under Emilio Aguinaldo resisted American rule. The Supreme Court's Insular Cases, 1901, held that full constitutional rights did not automatically extend to all U.S.-controlled territories. Abroad, the Open Door Notes, 1899–1900, asserted equal commercial access in China. U.S. troops participated in the suppression of the Boxer Uprising in 1900. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, 1901–1909, following William McKinley's 1901 assassination, marked a pivot toward reform while preserving much of the era's corporate framework. Roosevelt wielded the Sherman Act more aggressively, notably against Northern securities in 1904, backed railroad rate regulation, Elkins Act 1903, Hepburn Act 1906, and championed consumer protection after muckraking exposed abuses, Ida Tarbell's History of Standard Oil, 1904, and Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, 1906, spurred the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act in 1906. He also advanced conservation. The Forest Reserve Act's legacy expanded under him. The U.S. Forest Service began in 1905. Millions of acres of national forests, wildlife refuges, and national monuments were set aside. Abroad, he brokered the Panama Canal's construction, supporting Panama's separation from Colombia in 1903 and starting excavation in 1904, and articulated a Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, claiming a U.S. police power in the Western Hemisphere to preempt European intervention. Law and the courts often favored contract over regulation, but not uniformly. In Lochner v. New York 1905, the Supreme Court struck down a state law limiting bakers' hours, citing liberty of contract, whereas in Muller v. Oregon 1908, it upheld limits on women's work hours, accepting social science evidence about health. These decisions reflected a judiciary groping toward boundaries among police power, due process, and emerging social policy. Meanwhile, new state reforms, workmen's compensation, pure food laws, and utility commissions flickered into life by 1910. Culture and leisure modernized. Vaudeville theaters, Nickelodeons, and amusement parks like Coney Island offered mass entertainment. Organized sports grew. Baseball's first modern World Series was staged in 1903. College football spread, prompting rules reforms after fatal injuries. World's fairs celebrated technology and empire. Chicago's 1893 Columbian Exposition showcased electric lighting, a white city, and a particular vision of progress. The Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk in 1903, hinting at a new century of movement. In Detroit, Henry Ford introduced the Model T in 1908, promising mobility at lower cost. The moving assembly line was still ahead, but the democratization of the automobile had begun. Women's activism widened. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, NAWSA, formed in 1890 from earlier organizations, working state by state. Middle-class reformers built the infrastructure of progressive social policy, child labor campaigns, the National Child Labor Committee, 1904, with Lewis Hines Stark photography, public health nursing, and juvenile courts. Labor feminists pressed for wages and hours reforms in shops and mills. Although national suffrage would not arrive until 1920, by 1910, Western states were granting women the vote, and women were central to urban reform coalitions. Scientific management, or Taylorism, sought to measure and control shop floor labor for efficiency. Workers recognized it as intensified supervision. Unions adapted and grew in some sectors. The industrial workers of the world formed in 1905 to organize the unskilled across industries with a more radical vision than the AFL. Child labor and workplace safety remained acute problems. Reformers, agitation would crescendo in the next decade. Even where law lagged, the era's investigative journalism, muckraking, armed citizens with facts about municipal graft, corporate consolidation, and public health threats. For native nations, the frontier closed in census terms by 1890, but dispossession continued by policy. The Dawes Act 1887 allotted communal lands into individual parcels, opening surplus land to white settlement and undermining tribal sovereignty. Boarding schools strove to Americanize children. The Ghost Dance movement of 1890, a religious response to conquest and hunger, ended in tragedy at Wounded Knee, where U.S. troops killed hundreds of Lakota. By 1910, native citizenship and self-government remained constricted. Policy would not significantly reverse until the 20th century's later reforms. Race relations outside the South bore their own tensions. Black migrants moved into northern cities in growing numbers by the 1900s, laying groundwork for the Great Migration that would accelerate later. Race riots, such as the 1906 Atlanta riot, exposed national, not merely Southern white supremacy. Nevertheless, black newspapers, fraternal orders, and churches built institutions that sustained political life. The founding of the NAACP in 1909 brought together black and white reformers to pursue litigation and public advocacy against segregation and disenfranchisement. Politics at the city and state levels began to move from machine patronage to managerial reform. Tammany Hall still ruled New York politics, but good government leagues, nonpartisan city commissions, Galveston after the 1900 hurricane, and city manager forms were adopted as antidotes to graft. Civil service reform at the federal level had begun with the Pendleton Act in 1883 after President James Garfield's assassination in 1881. By 1910, merit systems were expanding in scope. The economy's scale brought both plenty and precarity. Real wages rose for many skilled workers, and consumer goods proliferated, yet recessions and strikes could quickly erase security. Child labor remained widespread in mills and mines. Company towns controlled rents and stores. Industrial accidents were frequent. At the same time, philanthropy from fortunes, Carnegie's libraries, Rockefeller's foundations, seeded universities, research, and public culture. Even as critics questioned the social cost of such wealth accumulation. By 1910, the United States was unmistakably industrial and urban, a continental power with overseas territories, and a polity awakening to the need for rules to match its scale. The era's contradictions were plain: astonishing engineering feats alongside tenement squalor, conservation on one hand and extractive booms on the other. New democratic energies and old exclusions hardened by law. The legal infrastructure of Jim Crow stood in the South. Immigration quotas had begun on the Pacific. Labor rights were tenuous. Women's suffrage was incomplete. Yet investigative journalism, civic reform, and new federal tools hinted that the political system could adapt. The phrase "Gilded Age" risks implying only sheen over rot. The record shows a deeper transformation. The creation of national markets, national media, and national regulatory debates that would dominate the 20th century. Americans argued, sued, organized, and increasingly legislated their way toward a different balance between private power and public authority. In the next chapter, that balance will be tested as progressive reformers push from cities to Washington for food safety, railroad oversight, labor protections, conservation, and political democratization, seeking to make the modern industrial nation safer, fairer, and more accountable. Between 1910 and 1918, the United States reworked the relationship between citizens, corporations, and the federal state, and abruptly stepped onto the world stage as a decisive belligerent in World War I. This period, often called the high tide of progressivism, joined investigative journalism, grassroots reform, and presidential action to regulate big business, widen democracy for some Americans, and mobilize the economy for war. It also exposed the limits of reform, especially around race, civil liberties, and labor, when the nation felt threatened. The progressive impulse preceded 1910, but it accelerated in these years. Muckraking journalists documented urban corruption, corporate abuses, and public health hazards. Cities experimented with commissions and city manager governments. States adopted direct primaries, initiative, referendum, and recall to curb party bosses. Settlement houses multiplied, with women reformers studying living conditions and pressing for sanitation, playgrounds, and juvenile courts. In 1911, a lethal factory fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York killed 146 workers, mostly immigrant women, galvanizing state labor reforms on hours, fire escapes, and building safety. Antitrust enforcement gathered force. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil and American Tobacco dissolved under the Sherman Act, adopting a rule of reason that distinguished between reasonable and unreasonable restraints of trade. The decisions signaled that giant firms would not be abolished wholesale, but combinations that stifled competition would face breakup or regulation. Reformers now sought not only to punish abuses, but to build a regulatory architecture that could manage national markets. The presidential election of 1912 became a referendum on progressivism's direction. Republican incumbent William Howard Taft defended judicially minded, case-by-case regulation. Former President Theodore Roosevelt, breaking away as a progressive bull moose, called for a new nationalism, stronger federal oversight of large corporations, social insurance, and labor protections. Democrat Woodrow Wilson advocated a new freedom, restore competition by attacking monopoly power, lowering tariffs, and reforming finance. Socialist Eugene V. Debs pressed for public ownership of key industries and stronger labor rights. With the Republican vote split, Wilson won. Wilson's first term delivered a concentrated burst of domestic reform. The Underwood, Simmons tariff of 1913 lowered duties substantially, and paired with the freshly ratified 16th Amendment, introduced a modern federal income tax to replace lost revenue and diversify federal finance. The Federal Reserve Act, 1913, created a central bank system with 12 regional reserve banks and a board in Washington, giving the government tools to add liquidity in crises and moderate credit cycles, an answer to the panics that had rattled the Gilded Age. Antitrust policy was rebuilt. The Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914, clarified illegal practices, price discrimination tying contracts, certain interlocking directorates, and protected unions and farm organizations from being treated as combinations in restraint of trade. The same year, Congress created the Federal Trade Commission to police unfair methods of competition. Together, these laws aim to make markets fairer without destroying every large enterprise. Progressive reform also reached farms and schools. The Smith-Lever Act, 1914, funded agricultural extension work through land-grant colleges, spreading new techniques to rural communities. The Federal Farm Loan Act, 1916, set up cooperative credit banks to ease farmers' access to loans. The Smith-Hughes Act, 1917, supported vocational education in agriculture, trades, and home economics, training a modern labor force. Conservation gained a permanent home when the National Park Service was established in 1916 to manage parks and monuments as a unified system. Social legislation broadened but ran into courts. The Adamson Act, 1916, established the 8-hour day for interstate railroad workers, averting a national strike. The Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, 1916, barred interstate commerce in goods produced by child labor under certain ages and hours. In 1918, the Supreme Court struck it down in Hammer v. Dagenhart, limiting federal power under the Commerce Clause. In Bunting v. Oregon, 1917, however, the court upheld a 10-hour day for factory workers, marking a partial acceptance of hours regulation. The legal terrain was shifting, contested case by case. Women's political activism surged. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, under leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt, advanced a state-by-state plan while seeking a federal amendment. The more confrontational National Woman's Party, led by Alice Paul, picketed the White House in 1917, endured arrests and hunger strikes, and drew public sympathy. By 1918, President Wilson endorsed a federal suffrage amendment, framing women's wartime service as a democratic claim, a step that would bear fruit just beyond our period with the 19th Amendment. The era's reform energies rarely protected Black Americans. In 1913, the Wilson administration segregated federal offices, reinforcing Jim Crow in the national government. Voter suppression continued across the South despite the Supreme Court's 1915 Ginn decision against grandfather clauses. New devices replaced the old. Lynching persisted. In 1917, white mobs attacked black workers in East St. Louis, Illinois, killing dozens in one of the worst race riots of the decade. That summer, the NAACP organized a silent parade down New York's Fifth Avenue to protest racial violence. Meanwhile, the Great Migration accelerated after 1915 as black Southerners moved to northern cities for wartime jobs and to escape disfranchisement, reshaping urban America and politics. Foreign policy tensions mounted in the Western Hemisphere before Europe's war touched the United States. The Mexican Revolution, beginning in 1910, destabilized the border. In 1914, after a diplomatic incident at Tampico, U.S. forces occupied Veracruz for several months. In 1916, following Pancho Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico, General John J. Pershing led a punitive expedition deep into northern Mexico without capturing Villa, withdrawing in early 1917 as larger events intervened. These episodes showed both U.S. reach and limits in a turbulent region. World War I began in Europe in 1914. President Wilson proclaimed neutrality, but U.S. trade, finance, and opinion tilted toward the Allies over time. German U-boat warfare threatened neutral shipping. In May 1915, a German submarine sank the British liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200, including 128 Americans. Public outrage was sharp, though the United States did not enter the war. Germany moderated its submarine policy with the Sussex Pledge, 1916, temporarily easing tensions. Wilson won re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," even as he advocated military preparedness. The calculus changed in early 1917. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, seeking to choke Britain before U.S. intervention could matter. The British shared the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico if the United States entered the war. Promising lost territories in the Southwest, an overture Mexico did not accept. German U-boats began sinking ships without warning, including American vessels. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. On April 6, the United States entered the conflict, casting the cause as a struggle to make the world safe for democracy. Mobilization was swift and sweeping. The Selective Service Act, May 1917, instituted a national draft. By war's end, nearly 3 million men would be inducted, joining volunteers to form the American Expeditionary Forces under Pershing. The Navy adopted convoy systems that dramatically reduced shipping losses to U-boats. Financing combined Liberty Loan campaigns, new taxes, and war revenue acts. The federal government built a wartime administrative state. The War Industries Board coordinated industrial priorities and raw materials under Bernard Baruch. The Food Administration, led by Herbert Hoover, promoted conservation, meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, and stabilized prices. The Fuel Administration managed coal and introduced daylight saving time. The U.S. Railroad Administration took control of railroads to improve efficiency. Labor relations were reworked for the emergency. The National War Labor Board mediated disputes, encouraged collective bargaining, and pressed for the 8-hour day and fair wages in defense industries. Union membership grew. Women entered factories and offices in larger numbers to replace men and meet increased demand. Many returned to pre-war roles afterward. But the precedent of industrial labor and equal citizenship claims strengthened suffrage arguments. Black workers moved into wartime plants, especially in steel and meatpacking. Their presence sparked both opportunity and backlash in northern cities. Government also managed mines. The Committee on Public Information under George Creel produced pamphlets, films, and 4-minute men, speeches to rally support and explain the war. Loyalty drives, however, slid easily into coercion. Congress passed the Espionage Act, 1917, and the Sedition Act, 1918, criminalizing obstruction of the draft and disloyal speech about the government, constitution, or military. Authorities prosecuted anti-war socialists and members of the industrial workers of the world. Federal agents and the American Protective League surveilled communities. The Supreme Court would uphold convictions under a clear and present danger test in 1919, but the prosecutions began here, in wartime. The United States arrived late to the Western Front, but mattered decisively in 1918. American troops first fought at Cantigny, May 1918, then helped blunt German offensives at Chateauguay, and famously at Belleau Wood in June, where U.S. Marines earned a fierce reputation. In September, the AEF executed the Saint-Mihiel Offensive, a successful American-led reduction of a salient. Immediately afterward, American and Allied forces launched the Meuse-Argonne campaign, the war's largest American operation, an exhausting push through forests and fortified lines that ran from late September to the armistice on November 11. U.S. manpower and materiel tipped the balance as Germany's home front faltered. Wilson set out his vision for peace early in 1918. The 14 points presented to Congress in January called for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, the removal of trade barriers, national self-determination in contested regions, arms reductions, and a League of Nations to provide collective security. These principles shaped armistice expectations and later peace talks, even where they collided with Allied aims for punishment or territorial gains. The points also fed hopes among colonized peoples worldwide, hopes not often realized in the settlements that followed. War brought scientific and social mobilization and sudden catastrophe. In 1918, an influenza pandemic swept the globe in multiple waves, killing tens of millions worldwide and hundreds of thousands in the United States. Cities closed schools and theaters. Public health measures waxed and waned with caseloads. The disease struck soldiers in crowded camps and civilians alike. The pandemic overlapped with war's end, compounding grief and testing local health systems that progressives had struggled to build. Civil liberties frayed under pressure. Peaceful dissenters went to prison. German-American communities faced suspicion. Schools dropped German language instruction. Vigilante groups policed neighbors. Yet other progressive themes advanced. Prohibitionists leveraged wartime grain conservation and anti-saloon sentiment, pushing the 18th Amendment through Congress in 1917, ratified in 1919. Suffragists tied women's service to national recognition, winning the president's endorsement in 1918 and building momentum for the 19th Amendment. This was the paradox of the moment. A bigger federal state could both extend democratic participation and restrict speech and association. The war transformed the economy. Federal purchasing spurred steel, chemicals, shipbuilding, and agriculture. Price controls and guaranteed markets steadied farmers. When controls lifted, post-war adjustments would be painful. But in 1917-1918, the rural sector boomed. The Fed still learned crisis management on the fly. Treasury and war agencies learned to coordinate with industry, skills that would become templates in later emergencies. The United States also revised its imperial relationships. In 1917, Congress passed the Jones-Shafroth Act, granting U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans while retaining territorial status. The island contributed soldiers and labor to the war effort. In the Philippines, promised gradual self-government under the 1916 Jones Act. Leaders watched Wilson's rhetoric about self-determination with interest, proof that domestic progressivism and global empire sat uneasily together. Courts issued mixed signals about race and rights amid wartime changes. In 1917, the Supreme Court invalidated a Louisville residential segregation ordinance in Buchanan v. Worley as a violation of property rights, even as Plessy's separate but equal remained intact elsewhere. The NAACP litigated and lobbied. Black newspapers encouraged service while demanding justice at home. And returning black veterans would soon insist more loudly that democracy abroad required democracy in America. By November 1918, the guns fell silent. Crowds celebrated the armistice in American streets. Soldiers began the long journey home. War agencies planned demobilization. Wilson traveled to Paris to help shape the peace, carrying the prestige of victory and the burden of persuading Americans to accept a global role with ongoing obligations. That struggle over the League of Nations, over how open or punitive the peace should be, and over how to reconcile civil liberties with national security, would define the years immediately ahead. The Progressive era's core wager was that modern problems required modern government, fact-finding commissions, expert agencies, and laws flexible enough to steer industrial capitalism toward public ends. Between 1910 and 1918, that wager partially paid off. The Federal Reserve stabilized finance. The FTC and Clayton Act curbed some abuses. Parks and schools expanded. Workers in key sectors won shorter hours. Women moved closer to full political rights. But the period also revealed durable boundaries. Jim Crow deepened. Wartime repression narrowed speech. Courts could halt social legislation, and reform often bypassed those without political clout. Standing at the end of 1918, the United States had become a creditor nation with a central bank, a larger regulatory state, and a mass army that had tipped a world war. The country had not resolved its deepest contradictions, but it had learned to wield modern tools of policy and power. The next chapter will trace how those tools, and the discontents they provoked, shaped the 1920s and beyond, as Americans tried to turn victory and reform into lasting peace and prosperity. The years 1920 to 1939 carried Americans from the exuberance of a consumer boom to the hardship of the worst economic crisis in modern history, and through an experiment in federal reform that reshaped the relationship between citizens, markets, and the state. The 2 decades were not opposites so much as connected chapters. The very forces that electrified the 1920s, credit, mass production, and global finance, amplified the vulnerabilities the 1930s exposed. The decade opened with a political and cultural pivot. In 1920, the 19th Amendment secured women's suffrage nationwide after decades of organizing. That same year, the 18th Amendment's prohibition regime, enforced by the Volstead Act, made the sale of alcoholic beverages illegal. Prohibition aimed to curb vice and workplace accidents. In practice, it spawned speakeasies, bootlegging networks, and violent organized crime, with figures like Al Capone emblematic of an unintended underworld economy. War weariness and fear of radicalism shaped early policy. The Red Scare of 1919-1920, fueled by strikes, bomb scares, and revolution abroad, brought surveillance and deportations under Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Congress tightened immigration with the Emergency Quota Act, 1921, and the Immigration Act of 1924, which set strict national origin quotas favoring Northern and Western Europeans, while virtually barring immigration from Asia. Nativism and a revived Ku Klux Klan, peaking mid-decade, imposed social policing by intimidation, even outside the South. Diplomacy sought stability without entangling alliances. The Washington Naval Conference, 1921-1922, produced arms limitation treaties among major naval powers. The Dawes Plan, 1924, and later the Young Plan, 1929, attempted to stabilize German reparations and European debts, binding the U.S. more deeply to a precarious international financial system. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, 1928, renounced war as national policy, idealistic, if unenforceable. The Roaring Twenties roared because productivity and consumption surged together. Assembly line production, pioneered in autos, spread to appliances and radios. Electrification reached cities and many towns. Advertising and national chains sold a modern lifestyle. Installment credit, buy now, pay later, turned durable goods into monthly bills. Ford's Model T and later competitors put cars within reach of the middle class. Paved roads, gas stations, and suburbs followed the automobile's path. Culture modernized in step. Radio networks linked households to news, sports, and music. Motion pictures moved from silent films to talkies, with The Jazz Singer, 1927. The Harlem Renaissance placed black art, literature, and music at the center of national culture. Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston in letters. Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong in jazz. Josephine Baker and others on stage. Meanwhile, conflicts over modernity surfaced in the 1925 Scopes trial in Tennessee, where the teaching of evolution became a public proxy fight over science, religion, and schools. Prosperity was uneven and often precarious. Many corporate profits rose faster than wages. Unions lost ground amid employer, open shop drives, and welfare capitalism schemes. Farmers, having borrowed to expand during World War I, faced falling prices throughout the decade as global production recovered. Foreclosures rose in the wheat and cotton belts even before the crash. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 granted U.S. citizenship to Native Americans, but allotment policies continued to erode communal lands. Boarding schools pressed assimilation. Politics favored business confidence. Republican presidents Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover lowered taxes on high incomes and corporations, trimmed regulation, and promoted cooperation between government and industry. Scandals like Teapot Dome, oil leases corruptly granted in the Harding era, tarnished the image of clean government. But Coolidge's motto, "The chief business of the American people is business," captured the prevailing mood. Hoover, a celebrated engineer and humanitarian, took office in 1929 expecting to manage prosperity, not crisis. Finance made the boom look endless. A rising stock market drew in small investors. Brokers extended easy margin loans. Investment trusts layered leverage. New issues flooded Wall Street. Newspapers ran ticker-tape columns like weather reports. Few paused to ask whether profits justified prices or whether credit was too loose. The correction became a collapse in autumn 1929. On Black Thursday, October 24, heavy selling shook markets. A brief rally failed. Black Monday, October 28, and Black Tuesday, October 29, brought panicked liquidation. The stock crash did not cause the Great Depression alone, but it damaged balance sheets, froze new investment, and shattered confidence. As factories cut output, layoffs cascaded. Falling incomes triggered further cutbacks, a vicious cycle. Structural weaknesses deepened the downturn. Banks, small and thinly capitalized in many towns, failed by the thousands as depositors, lacking insurance, rushed to withdraw cash at the first rumor. Falling farm prices wrecked rural banks in particular. Internationally, war debt and reparation payments tied the U.S. to European instability. As American lenders pulled back, credit dried up overseas, feeding a global contraction. Protectionism worsened the slide. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff 1930 invited retaliation and choked trade when economies most needed it. Nature joined economics in catastrophe. Drought and poor soil practices in the plains produced the Dust Bowl of the mid-1930s, black blizzards that stripped fields and drove families from farms. Okie migrants, many not from Oklahoma alone, headed west in search of seasonal work, filling camps that became symbols of a broader national displacement. President Hoover's early response followed established limits. He encouraged voluntary cooperation among businesses to maintain wages, expanded public works, including what would be named Hoover Dam, and created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1932 to lend to banks and railroads. But he resisted large-scale direct relief to individuals, fearing moral hazard and budget consequences. Shanty towns, Hoovervilles, sprang up on urban margins. The bonus army of World War I veterans marched on Washington in 1932 seeking accelerated bonus payments, only to be dispersed by troops, an episode that further damaged the administration's standing. The 1932 election brought a decisive shift. Franklin D. Roosevelt promised bold, persistent experimentation and a New Deal for the American people. In March 1933, as banking panic peaked, he declared a national bank holiday, pushed through the Emergency Banking Act to triage solvency, and used fireside chats to explain reforms directly to households. Confidence ticked up, deposits returned to reopened banks, banking and finance were rebuilt. The Glass-Steagall Act, 1933, separated commercial and investment banking and created the FDIC to ensure deposits. The Securities Act, 1933, and the Securities Exchange Act, 1934, established disclosure rules and the Securities and Exchange Commission to police markets. The dollar was detached from gold domestically. The Gold Reserve Act, 1934, devalued the dollar to raise prices and expand monetary room for recovery. Relief and jobs arrived quickly. The Civilian Conservation Corps, 1933, employed young men in reforestation, park building, and erosion control. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration funded local relief. The Civil Works Administration provided short-term winter jobs. Large projects through the Public Works Administration built bridges, schools, and dams. The Tennessee Valley Authority, 1933, married regional planning with power generation, flood control, and rural electrification across a multi-state region. Industry and agriculture were targeted for stabilization. The National Industrial Recovery Act, 1933, created the NRA, which encouraged industries to draft codes of fair competition, setting minimum wages, hours, and practices under a blue eagle symbol. Critics saw cartelization risks. Supporters viewed it as emergency coordination in a deflationary spiral. In agriculture, the AAA 1933 aimed to raise farm prices by paying producers to limit output. Checks helped farm incomes, but sparked controversy for benefiting landowners over sharecroppers and tenants. The Supreme Court forced adjustments. In 1935, Schechter Poultry v. United States struck down the NRA codes as an overreach of federal power. In 1936, United States v. Butler invalidated the original AAA processing taxes. The administration pivoted toward programs resting on clearer constitutional foundations and direct federal spending. The Second New Deal, 1935-1936, reshaped labor and social policy. The Works Progress Administration became the era's largest employer, building roads, parks, and airports while funding artists, writers, and musicians in Federal One projects. The Wagner Act, National Labor Relations Act, 1935, guaranteed workers the right to organize and bargain collectively, creating the NLRB to police unfair labor practices. Industrial unionism surged. The CIO organized mass production workers. The Flint sit-down strike, 1936-1937, secured recognition at General Motors, signaling a new balance on the factory floor. Social insurance took legislative form. The Social Security Act of 1935 established old-age pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid to certain vulnerable groups. It did not initially cover many agricultural and domestic workers, disproportionately affecting Black and Mexican American laborers, and benefits were modest at first. Yet it marked a new baseline. The federal government would pool risk across generations. The New Deal redrew rural and native policy. The Soil Conservation Service promoted contour plowing and shelter belts to fight erosion. The Rural Electrification Administration extended power to farms through cooperatives. The Indian Reorganization Act, 1934, ending allotment and encouraging tribal self-government, began a slow turn from earlier assimilationist policy. Though implementation varied and resources were thin, women and the New Deal found an advocate in Eleanor Roosevelt, whose travel and correspondence connected the White House to relief clients, workers, and civil rights activists. Frances Perkins, Secretary of Labor, the first woman in a U.S. cabinet, helped craft labor and safety laws. Yet gender norms and program rules often kept married women at the margins of relief jobs. Change was real but partial. Race and the Depression exposed both activism and limits. Black Americans, hit early and hard by job loss, shifted decisively toward the Democratic coalition as New Deal relief arrived. The Black Cabinet of Advisors pressed agencies for fair treatment. Some gains came through WPA employment and youth programs. Anti-lynching bills, however, died in the Senate. Southern segregationists shaped key legislation, like the exclusion of farm and domestic workers from Social Security and the minimum wage, entrenching disparities. In 1939, after the Daughters of the American Revolution barred her from Constitution Hall, Marian Anderson sang at the Lincoln Memorial in a concert arranged by Eleanor Roosevelt, a symbolic rebuke to Jim Crow. The Supreme Court fight of 1937 marked the high-water line of New Deal conflict. After a string of adverse decisions, Roosevelt proposed adding justices to the court. The court-packing plan backfired politically, but a judicial switch in time, beginning with West Coast Hotel v. Parrish, 1937, upholding a state minimum wage, signaled greater deference to social and economic legislation. The Fair Labor Standards Act, 1938, followed, establishing a federal minimum wage, maximum hours, and new child labor limits. Recovery was uneven. Output and employment improved from the 1933 trough, then dipped again in the Roosevelt recession of 1937-1938, when spending was cut and the Fed tightened reserves, evidence that demand remained fragile. A renewed spending push, along with export orders as war approached in Europe, lifted activity late in the decade, but full employment would arrive only with World War II. Cities and homes changed as policy filtered into daily life. The home owners, loan corporation refinanced mortgages and mapped urban credit risk. Its residential security maps contributed to long-lasting redlining that starved minority neighborhoods of investment. The Federal Housing Administration standardized long-term, low-down payment loans, helping build a mass market for suburban homes, benefits that flowed unequally by race because of private and public discrimination. The New Deal remade politics. A durable coalition, urban ethnics, white Southerners, farmers, industrial workers, many black Northerners, and new intellectuals, kept Democrats dominant through the decade. Radio knit leaders to voters in new ways. FDR's fireside chats gave policy a conversational intimacy. Critics on the right warned of statism and deficits. Radicals on the left demanded more direct wealth redistribution. The administration navigated between, trading experimentation for ideological purity. Abroad, Americans recoiled from European turmoil. Congress passed Neutrality Acts, 1935-1937, to restrict arms sales and loans to belligerents. Public opinion favored staying out of conflicts as fascist regimes rose in Italy, Germany, and Japan. Yet isolation was never complete. U.S. trade continued. Diplomacy watched war clouds gather. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, a decade of domestic reform faced a world crisis that would reorder priorities again. The twin arcs of the 1920s and 1930s left a complex legacy. The 1920s proved how technology, credit, and culture could accelerate growth and reshape life, and how imbalances could accumulate in plain sight. The 1930s proved that a democratic government could cushion collapse, regulate finance, widen labor rights, and ensure some of life's risks, while also revealing how power can leave out those with the least leverage. Together, they created the institutional scaffolding, central banking, deposit insurance, social insurance, labor law, federal regulation, that would structure American capitalism thereafter. Standing at the end of 1939, Americans had been sobered but not defeated. Breadlines had shortened, farms held their soil better, the elderly had a modest pension, workers had a stronger voice, and the federal government had new tools to steady the economy. The next chapter would test those tools under the pressure of global war, as the United States moved from Depression recovery to becoming the arsenal of democracy. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Europe plunged into war for the second time in a generation. The United States declared neutrality, but Americans watched closely as Nazi Germany overran Denmark and Norway in April 1940, crushed France in June, and bombed Britain through that summer and fall. The question in Washington was no longer whether war threatened the world order. It was whether the United States could remain outside it and still be safe. President Franklin D. Roosevelt edged policy from neutrality toward non-belligerent support for those resisting aggression. Cash and carry rules in 1939 allowed sales to belligerents who transported goods in their own ships, tilting help toward Britain and France. After France fell, the United States transferred destroyers to Britain in 1940 in exchange for base rights in the Western Hemisphere, and by early 1940, one Congress passed Lend-Lease, authorizing vast supplies to Britain, and after June 1941, to the Soviet Union once Germany invaded it. American factories began to hum. The nation was not yet at war, but it had chosen a side. At sea, the Atlantic grew lethal. German U-boats targeted merchant convoys, the U.S. Navy extended neutrality patrols, escorted convoys partway, and clashed with submarines even before formal entry into the war. In August 1941, Roosevelt met Winston Churchill off Newfoundland to issue the Atlantic Charter, setting out shared principles: no territorial aggrandizement, self-determination, freer trade, improved labor standards, and a broader peace structure, foreshadowing a post-war order. The war reached American shores on December 7, 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, killing more than 2,400 and crippling battleships at anchor. Japan simultaneously attacked U.S., British, and Dutch positions across the Pacific. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States shortly after. Isolation ended in an instant. A global two-ocean war began. Mobilization transformed the economy and daily life. Congress expanded the draft and raised a mass army and navy. The War Production Board directed materials. The Office of Price Administration rationed gasoline, rubber, sugar, and more. And the War Manpower Commission balanced factory and farm labor needs. Industry converted with astonishing speed. Auto plants turned out tanks and trucks. Shipyards launched Liberty ships in weeks. Aircraft factories produced bombers and fighters by the tens of thousands. By 1944, the United States was producing an overwhelming share of the Allies' weapons. This was the arsenal of democracy Roosevelt had envisioned. The home front shifted socially as well. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. African Americans, often excluded from skilled jobs, pressed for fair employment. Philip Randolph's threatened march on Washington prompted Executive Order 8802 in 1941, prohibiting racial discrimination in defense industries and creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee. Gains came, though segregation and pay gaps persisted. The Double V campaign, victory over fascism abroad and racism at home, captured the moment's aspiration and tension. War also brought fear and injustice. In early 1942, Executive Order 9066 authorized the forced removal of about 120,000 Japanese Americans, most U.S. citizens, from West Coast homes to inland camps. Military necessity was the official rationale. Later investigations found no evidence of widespread disloyalty and concluded that racism and wartime hysteria drove the policy. Yet Japanese American volunteers, most famously of the 100th Battalion 442nd Regimental Combat Team, fought with distinction in Europe, while Navajo code talkers in the Pacific used their language to secure communications beyond enemy decryption. The first major U.S. ground operations targeted the periphery of Hitler's Europe. In late 1942, American and British forces landed in North Africa. Operation Torch fought the Afrika Korps, and after a hard campaign, helped force Axis surrender in Tunisia in May 1943. Sicily followed in July, then the slow, costly drive up the Italian peninsula. Italy surrendered in September 1943, but German forces fought on tenaciously south of Rome and along the Gothic line. Mountains and weather turned the theater into a grinding test of logistics and endurance. In the air and at sea, the Allies fought for control. In the Atlantic, improved radar, code-breaking, long-range patrol aircraft, and better convoy tactics turned the U-boat tide by mid-1943, enabling safe passage of men and materiel to Britain. In Europe's skies, the U.S. 8th Air Force and the RAF waged a strategic bombing campaign against German industry and oil, sustaining heavy losses while gradually eroding the enemy's capacity. Bombing's effectiveness remains debated in detail, but the cumulative pressure, especially against fuel, mattered as the land war closed in. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the ground war after 1941, absorbing and then reversing immense German offensives. Stalingrad's destruction and the German surrender there in early 1943, followed by the armored battle at Kursk that summer, marked a shift in momentum. Allied strategy depended on Soviet resistance. Lend-Lease trucks, rails, and food moved east even as the Red Army provided the vast majority of the ground fighting against Germany. Planning for the decisive Western assault culminated in 1944. On June 6, D-Day, Allied forces stormed Normandy's beaches under General Dwight D. Eisenhower's command. A hard June and hedgerow fighting gave way to a breakout in July. Paris was liberated in August. An ambitious attempt to leap the Rhine at Arnhem in Operation Market Garden failed in September. Then in December, Germany counterattacked through the Ardennes in the Battle of the Bulge. After brutal winter fighting, the Allies sealed the salient and resumed the advance. In spring 1945, Allied armies crossed the Rhine, liberated camps and cities, and converged on the Elbe as Soviet forces drove into Berlin from the east. The Holocaust became undeniable as Allied troops opened concentration and death camps in 1944-1945, Buchenwald, Dachau, and others, finding emaciated survivors and the machinery of murder. While news of mass killings had circulated earlier, and the War Refugee Board formed in 1944 to aid rescue, the scale and system of genocide shocked liberators and publics anew. The discovery sharpened resolve and shaped post-war trials. Later that year, the Allies would begin the Nuremberg prosecutions of top Nazi leaders. In the Pacific, the war's course ran from disaster to dominance. Japan seized the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies in early 1942. The U.S. Navy and Marines halted the Japanese in the Coral Sea in May, blocking an advance on Port Moresby, and won a decisive carrier victory at Midway in June, sinking 4 Japanese carriers and shifting the strategic balance. From August 1942, the 6-month struggle for Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands marked Japan's first major land defeat and exposed the limits of its supply lines. The United States and its allies adopted a twin-axis advance. General Douglas MacArthur moved through New Guinea toward the Philippines. Admiral Chester Nimitz drove across the Central Pacific by island hopping, bypassing strongholds to seize airfields and harbors needed to bring bombers within range of Japan. Tarawa's shocking casualty rates in 1943 previewed the ferocity ahead. Saipan and Tinian in mid-1944 enabled B-29 bases. The Great Marianas Turkey shoot crippled Japanese naval aviation. The Philippines Campaign, Leyte Gulf in October 1944, among the largest naval battles in history, broke Japan's fleet and introduced large-scale kamikaze attacks. The final island battles were among the war's bloodiest. Iwo Jima, captured in early 1945 at terrible cost, provided emergency landing fields for bombers and fighter escort range. Okinawa, seized by June after months of combat and thousands of kamikaze sorties, served as a staging area for invasion plans. Meanwhile, U.S. B-29s shifted to low-altitude incendiary raids. The firebombing of Tokyo and other cities in spring 1945 killed tens of thousands and devastated urban cores. Behind the lines, science and administration made modern war possible. Radar, penicillin, synthetic rubber, and the proximity fuse altered combat and survival. The Manhattan Project, conceived amid fear of a German atomic bomb, built facilities at Oak Ridge and Hanford, and a laboratory at Los Alamos under J. Robert Oppenheimer. On December 2, 1942, the first controlled nuclear chain reaction ran beneath Chicago's Stagg Field. By July 16, 1945, the Trinity test in New Mexico proved a fission device workable. A weapon of unprecedented power now existed. As Germany collapsed, Hitler died by suicide on April 30, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, VE Day. The Allies turned fully to Japan. Diplomatic warnings followed. The Potsdam Declaration in July demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, promising prompt and utter destruction if it refused. Japan's leaders debated terms, especially the emperor's status. On August 6, 1945, a U.S.B. dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9, a second was dropped on Nagasaki. The same day, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, invading Manchuria and swiftly overrunning Japanese forces there. Scholars continue to debate the relative weight of these shocks. Together, they compelled surrender. Japan announced acceptance of Allied terms on August 15, VJ Day, and formal surrender was signed aboard USS Missouri on September 2. Even as armies fought, leaders planned the peace. The Tehran Conference, 1943, coordinated Allied strategy and affirmed a second front in France. At Yalta, February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin discussed post-war occupation zones in Germany, the United Nations structure, and Soviet entry into the war against Japan. At Bretton Woods, July 1944, economists and diplomats created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to stabilize currencies and finance reconstruction. Dumbarton Oaks, 1944, outlined a new global organization. In June 1945, delegates in San Francisco signed the United Nations Charter, envisioning a forum to prevent future wars. The war reached into millions of American homes and redefined citizenship. The 1944 Servicemen's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill, offered veterans tuition and low-cost mortgages, enabling college attendance and homeownership on a scale previously unimaginable. It helped expand the middle class after 1945, even as discriminatory lending and local practices meant benefits flowed unevenly across race and region. Demobilization brought joy and strain as wartime jobs wound down and families reunited. Casualties and costs defy easy summary. More than 400,000 Americans died in service. The human losses across Europe and Asia numbered in the tens of millions. The United States emerged physically intact, with its industrial base enlarged and its financial power commanding. That contrast, destruction abroad, capacity at home, explains the shift in global weight. By 1945, the United States had become a superpower with the atomic bomb, a blue water navy, and an economy underwriting allies. The war also exposed contradictions that would shape the next era. Black service members fought in segregated units, yet distinguished themselves, from the Tuskegee Airmen in Europe to sailors, soldiers, and Marines across theaters. Their service strengthened demands for civil rights that would crest in the decades to follow. Women's wartime work demonstrated competence in every industrial and service role. Many left factory jobs after 1945, but expectations and possibilities had changed. Japanese American incarceration left a legacy of trauma. Decades later, the nation would acknowledge the injustice and offer redress. Strategic alliances hardened into post-war alignments. Cooperation with the Soviet Union had been tactical and temporary. As armies met in the heart of Europe, disagreements over elections in Eastern Europe and the shape of German recovery sharpened. Lend-lease to the USSR wound down abruptly after VE Day. Mutual suspicion rose. The seeds of the Cold War, ideological rivalry, spheres of influence, atomic secrecy, were planted even before peace treaties were signed. If American power awakened in these years, it did so through logistics and coalition as much as through battle. The United States learned to coordinate industry, science, and allies on a continental scale, to fight a maritime, air, and land war simultaneously on opposite sides of the globe, and to articulate a vision, however imperfectly realized, of a rules-based order. It also learned that total war strains liberties, as with sedition prosecutions, race riots, and internment, and that rebuilding peace demands institutions, not just victories. By the close of 1945, the nation stood at a hinge of history. The Depression had ended, the war had been won, and a new architecture, Bretton Woods, the United Nations, the GI Bill, had begun to channel America's vast capacity. The price had been high, the responsibilities ahead were higher still. The next chapter will trace how the United States carried wartime momentum into a long, anxious peace, containing rivals, extending prosperity, and wrestling at home with the freedoms for which it had just fought. In 1945, the United States stood unmatched, its industry intact, its finances dominant, and its military victorious. Yet the peace immediately exposed a new rivalry with the Soviet Union, an ideological and geopolitical contest that would shape world affairs for half a century. At home, prosperity collided with persistent inequalities, sparking civil rights movements that redefined citizenship. By 2000, the U.S. emerged as the lone superpower of a globalized economy, but also a nation grappling with the social legacies of the long Cold War. The early Cold War coalesced around containment, the idea that Soviet expansion should be checked over time by Allied strength. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine pledged aid to Greece and Turkey against pressure from communist movements and neighbors. The Marshall Plan, announced the same year, poured billions into Western European recovery, tying rebuilt economies to U.S. markets. In 1948-1949, the Berlin airlift broke a Soviet blockade without firing a shot, flying food and fuel into West Berlin until the road and rail links reopened. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, formalized a collective defense pact. That same year, the Soviets tested an atomic bomb, ending the U.S. nuclear monopoly, and Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China after a civil war, events that widened the strategic map. Cold War turned hot in Korea. In June 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. A United Nations coalition led by the U.S. intervened. Dramatic swings, MacArthur's Incheon landing, Chinese entry, ended in a bloody stalemate near the original line. The armistice of 1953 left a divided peninsula and a cautionary lesson. Limited war in the nuclear age could be costly and inconclusive. At home, the national security state took lasting shape. The National Security Act of 1947 created the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the National Security Council. Fear of subversion fueled McCarthyism, congressional investigations and loyalty oaths that damaged careers and chilled dissent, until hearings and pushback curbed the excesses by the mid-1950s. Meanwhile, the GI Bill sent veterans to college and into new homes. Suburban tracts like Levittown embodied the age of mass consumption, while redlining and racial covenants channeled those benefits unevenly. The struggle for civil rights accelerated after World War II. In 1954, the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision rejected separate but equal in public schools. Implementation met resistance. The Little Rock Nine needed federal troops in 1957 to enter Central High. The Montgomery bus boycott, 1955-1956, elevated new leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and voter registration drives brought national attention to Jim Crow's daily humiliations and violence. The federal government's role grew under Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, remaking transport in suburbs. He also sent troops to Little Rock. Kennedy backed civil rights legislation before his 1963 assassination. The March on Washington that year tied economic justice to civil rights. King's "I Have a Dream" speech framed equality as a national promise overdue. The Cold War extended into space and the Caribbean. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 spurred U.S. investment in science and math. The creation of NASA, and a race culminating in Apollo 11's moon landing in 1969. In Cuba, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was followed by the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days of nuclear brinkmanship ended with Soviet missile withdrawal from Cuba and a private pledge regarding U.S. missiles in Turkey, plus a test ban momentum that yielded the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963. Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society paired civil rights breakthroughs with anti-poverty programs. The Civil Rights Act, 1964, outlawed discrimination in public accommodations and employment. The Voting Rights Act, 1965, ended key barriers to black enfranchisement. The 1968 Fair Housing Act targeted segregation in housing. Medicare and Medicaid, 1965, created health insurance for the elderly and the poor. Head Start, food stamps, and other initiatives aimed to widen opportunity. Poverty rates fell, especially among seniors, even as new tensions emerged over urban unrest, policing, and the pace of change. Vietnam overshadowed the late 1960s. After years of advisory roles, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, and U.S. troop levels rose sharply. A grinding war of attrition, combined with an insurgency and fragile South Vietnamese politics, eroded public support. The Tet Offensive in early 1968, tactically costly for North Vietnam but strategically shocking for Americans, helped convince Johnson not to seek re-election. The war spurred protests, generational rifts, and debates over credibility and morality in foreign policy. The era witnessed other transformative movements. Second-wave feminism, catalyzed by works like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, 1963, pursued legal equality, the 1963 Equal Pay Act, Title IX in 1972, and broader social change. Roe v. Wade, 1973, recognized a constitutional right to abortion within limits. The Stonewall Uprising, 1969, marked a turning point in LGBTQ activism. The environmental movement surged after oil spills and rivers catching fire. The National Environmental Policy Act, 1969, the Environmental Protection Agency, 1970, and the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, 1970-1972, set new federal standards. Native activism, from the occupation of Alcatraz, 1969, to Wounded Knee, 1973, pressed for sovereignty, culminating in the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, 1975. Richard Nixon sought to contain costs abroad while reshaping politics at home. He advanced détente with the Soviet Union. SALT I, 1972, limited certain strategic systems, and opened relations with the People's Republic of China via his 1972 visit. Domestically, he accepted some expansions of federal regulation OSHA, EPA enforcement, affirmative action frameworks, even as he cultivated a law and order message. Watergate exposed an abuse of power and a cover-up. Congressional investigations and court rulings forced the release of tapes, and Nixon resigned in 1974, the only U.S. president to do so. Economic headwinds arrived as the long post-war boom ended. The 1973 oil embargo triggered energy shortages and inflation. Productivity growth slowed. Stagflation challenged Keynesian tools. Gerald Ford's brief presidency emphasized restraint. Jimmy Carter pursued energy conservation and deregulation in some sectors, airlines, trucking, while elevating human rights in foreign policy. He brokered the 1978 Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, a durable peace. Yet domestic malaise and the 1979-1981 Iran hostage crisis undercut public confidence. A policy turn came with Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. Reaganomics combined tax cuts, deregulation trends, and a strong dollar, after the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker broke inflation with high interest rates. The early 1980s recession gave way to expansion, but deficits widened and inequality increased. Reagan rebuilt defense, launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, and took a tougher line against the USSR, while negotiating when opportunities appeared. The late Cold War pivoted on leadership change in Moscow. Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, aimed to reform a stagnating system. Summits with Reagan produced arms control progress. The 1987 INF Treaty eliminated a whole class of missiles. Popular movements in Eastern Europe accelerated collapse. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. By 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved into independent states. The Cold War ended without a U.S. Soviet war, an outcome shaped by sustained deterrence, arms control, economic pressures, and local democratic revolutions. The end of the Cold War did not end conflict. In 1990-1991, the U.S. led a UN-backed coalition in the Gulf War to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait, showcasing precision air power, coalition logistics, and limits. The coalition did not remove Saddam Hussein from power. Humanitarian and peacekeeping missions. Somalia and the Balkans in the 1990s tested post-Cold War aims and patience. NATO expanded eastward later in the decade, reflecting new security assumptions and anxieties in Europe. Globalization defined the 1990s economy. The North American Free Trade Agreement, 1994, integrated U.S., Canadian, and Mexican markets. The World Trade Organization, 1995, formalized global trade rules. Computing leapt from hobbyist garages to the center of commerce. Microsoft and Apple matured. The Internet opened to commercial use. Venture capital financed .com startups. Productivity surged in information sectors. A roaring stock market closed the decade, alongside growing debates about offshoring, wage stagnation for some, and the digital divide. Domestic policy in the 1990s mixed reform and contention. The 1994 Contract with America brought a Republican congressional wave and confrontations over budgets. Welfare reform in 1996 replaced aid to families with dependent children with temporary assistance for needy families, emphasizing work requirements and time limits. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 deregulated and consolidated media markets. Financial deregulation culminated in the 1999 Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, easing separations among banking, securities, and insurance. President Bill Clinton presided over late-decade surpluses, but was impeached in 1998 over perjury, an obstruction related to a personal scandal. He was acquitted in the Senate and finished his term. Immigration policy and patterns shifted. The 1965 Hart-Celler Act had replaced national origins quotas, opening doors to Asia, Latin America, and Africa. By the 1980s-1990, immigration reshaped cities and suburbs. The 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act legalized many undocumented residents while tightening employer sanctions. Debates over border control, labor markets, and identity intensified, foreshadowing 21st century politics. Public health and rights movements reframed citizenship. The AIDS epidemic, first identified in the early 1980s, devastated communities and spurred activism that accelerated research, treatment access, and public education. The Americans with Disabilities Act, 1990, barred discrimination and mandated accessibility, transforming public spaces and employment norms. Gun violence, spotlighted by tragedies like the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, a domestic terror attack, and school shootings prompted new law enforcement strategies and policy debates. Crime rose in the late 1980s and fell sharply in the 1990s due to a mix of factors still debated. The environment remained a national concern beyond the 1970s reforms. Disasters such as the 1989 Exxon Valdez spill renewed focus on corporate accountability and ecosystems, while market-based tools like emissions trading in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments targeted acid rain. Internationally, early climate diplomacy and ozone protection, the Montreal Protocol, 1987, hinted at a new era of environmental governance. Courts tracked societal change. Miranda, 1966, had mandated warnings for suspects. Later rulings trimmed or clarified police powers. Affirmative action cases like Regents of the University of California v. Back 1978 upheld some uses of race in admissions while barring quotas. Debates over busing, diversity, and equal protection continued. Roe v. Wade, 1973, remained contested, with incremental state restrictions and a national culture war unfolding through the 1990s. The U.S. also confronted the economic geography of deindustrialization. Factory closures in older manufacturing corridors shifted work to Sunbelt metros and overseas. Unions lost density outside the public sector. New service and tech jobs rose. Racial wealth gaps, unequal schooling, and neighborhood segregation, shaped by decades of policy and markets, persisted even amid overall growth. Fueling local reform efforts and federal initiatives like the Earned Income Tax Credit expansion. By 2000, the United States stood alone atop the global system. Its military reach was unmatched. The dollar anchored world finance. Its culture, music, film, software, circulated everywhere. NATO and alliances knit together old rivals. Trade and capital flowed at unprecedented scale. Yet dominance brought dilemmas. Humanitarian expectations without clear limits, economic integration with dislocation at home, and technological acceleration with privacy and equity concerns. The Cold War's end and the rights revolutions had broadened the meaning of American citizenship, even as debates endured over how far equality should extend and how best to secure it. The federal state that grew from the New Deal and wartime mobilization had learned to regulate, insure, and sometimes intervene more deeply, while markets and innovations continued to move faster than law. The story of 1945-2000, then, is not only a chronicle of superpower ascent, it is a record of social transformation, of laws, movements, and technologies that reshaped everyday life. As the century closed, Americans looked outward with confidence and inward with unresolved questions. They had avoided nuclear war, toppled an empire without invading it, walked on the moon, and connected the world by fiber and satellite. They had also wrestled, imperfectly, with segregation's legacies, gender inequality, and waves of new immigration. The stage was set for a new millennium in which the United States would test whether global leadership and domestic cohesion could coexist. Lessons drawn from 55 years of cold peace, hot wars, and civic reinvention. From scattered colonies on an indigenous continent to a federal union, a continental republic, and finally a global superpower. The United States remade its scale and its purpose between 1600 and 2000. At each turning, 1776 and 1787, 1863 and 1865, 1933 and 1945, the nation answered the crisis by widening the work of government and the meaning of citizenship, even as exclusions and contradictions persisted. The young republic tested ideas uncommon in the 18th century: popular sovereignty, written constitutions, and enumerated rights. Expansion brought wealth and violence in tandem. Native dispossession, the growth of slavery with cotton, and regional antagonisms that only civil war could resolve. Emancipation and the Reconstruction Amendments promised equal citizenship. Their partial enforcement left a long struggle ahead. But the constitutional floor they set would become the lever for later reform. Industrialization after 1877 bound regions into national markets. Railroads, steel, oil, and electricity created corporate power large enough to require federal referees. Immigration peopled the factories and cities that made the modern economy. The same decades hardened Jim Crow in the South and exclusion at the gates, proof that growth could coexist with hierarchy unless law and movements intervened. Between 1910 and 1945, the state learned to manage scale. The Federal Reserve and antitrust tools, the income tax, national parks, and public health systems. Then wartime mobilization on a continental level. World War II's arsenal of democracy ended depression at home and fascism abroad. Bretton Woods and the United Nations sketched a rules-based order that multiplied American influence far beyond its shores. The Cold War framed a long contest of ideas, industry, and alliances. Containment, NATO, and the Marshall Plan pressured the Soviet system until it cracked in 1989–1991. At home, civil rights movements translated Reconstruction's promise into statute. Brown, 1954, the Civil Rights Act, 1964, the Voting Rights Act, 1965, while feminism, environmentalism, Native activism, and LGBTQ organizing expanded the circle of rights. The Great Society and later reforms built a safety net that, however imperfect, changed life expectancy, poverty, and access to education. By century's end, the U.S. economy had shifted from mills to microchips. The GI Bill helped create a mass middle class. Interstate highways redrew maps, research universities, venture capital, and defense labs fed a technology frontier that put astronauts on the moon in 1969 and the public on the internet in the 1990s. Trade agreements and the dollar's centrality knit the country into global supply chains, sources of both prosperity and dislocation. The American century was never simple triumph. Segregation outlasted Appomattox by a century. Immigration quotas and internment exposed the corrosions of fear. Vietnam, Watergate, and economic shocks humbled certainty. Yet the record also shows a system capable of self-correction. Through elections, courts, movements, and sometimes apology and redress. What endures from 1600–2000 is not a straight line but a repertoire. Constitutionalism, federated power, civic organizing, scientific enterprise, and a recurring insistence that the nation's stated ideals apply more widely over time. That is the through line from Lexington to Selma, from Homestead to Flint, from Apollo to the fall of the Berlin Wall. As the 20th century closed, the United States held unmatched military reach, cultural influence, and economic scale, alongside unresolved questions about inclusion and the terms of global leadership. The work ahead, beyond 2000, remains the same work that defined the centuries behind it. To align power with principle, prosperity with justice, and ambition with responsibility. That unfinished project is the truest legacy of the American century.